tried writing this so many times I've lost count. Every time, I get a few paragraphs in before I close the laptop and tell myself I'll do it later, when I have the right words, when it doesn't feel like I'm tearing something open inside my chest. But there are no right words. And honestly, I remember everything too well. That's the problem. My brain won't let me forget a single detail. Every conversation, every decision, every moment I chose to keep going when I should have stopped. It's all there, sharp and clear, like it happened yesterday. I'm not writing this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm not asking you to understand. I already know what people will say, that I was broke, desperate, scared. Sure, that's all true, but that's not why I kept doing it. That's the easy explanation, the one that lets me off the hook. The real reason is harder to say out loud, because it means admitting I could turn off parts of myself I didn't know could be switched off, that I could compartmentalize my behavior to a degree that still unsettles me, even now, even after everything. 18 months ago, my life was ordinary, boring even, the kind of boring that other people probably envied. I worked at a marketing agency in Manchester, one of those mid-sized firms that handles accounts nobody's ever heard of, but that somehow keep the lights on. I split rent on a flat with my girlfriend Sarah and convinced myself this was what being an adult looked like. Wake up, go to work, come home, watch something on Netflix, repeat. The job wasn't exciting, but it paid on time, every time. I'd learned to measure happiness by how predictable things were, how stable. Excitement was for people who hadn't yet realized that stability was the real prize. Sarah and I had been together long enough that our routines had merged. We knew each other's schedules, split the bills without arguing about it, had our spots on the sofa. It wasn't passionate anymore, but I told myself that was normal. That passion was just the opening act, and what we had was the sustainable version, the real thing. Looking back, I wonder if I was already trying to convince myself of things I didn't quite believe. The redundancy meeting was surreal in how scripted it felt. I was called in on a Wednesday afternoon, and the moment I saw my manager sitting with someone from HR, I knew. Everyone in that room had already processed what was about to happen to me. They'd had their meetings, made their decisions, prepared their talking points. The company was downsizing. My role was non-essential. Budget cuts, market conditions. They thanked me for my contributions, said they appreciated my work, handed me a folder explaining my final pay and notice period. The whole thing took maybe 15 minutes. I nodded through the whole thing, not because I agreed, but because my brain couldn't catch up. There was this weird disconnect between what I was hearing and what I was processing, like watching something happen to someone else. I even said thank you as I left the room. Thank you. For what? For destroying the stability I'd built my entire identity around. At first, unemployment felt temporary. I treated it like a gap between jobs rather than an ending. I updated my CV, spent hours tweaking the wording, sent out applications. I told Sarah not to worry. Something would come up quickly. Manchester was full of agencies. I had experience, good references. There was no reason to think I'd struggle as much as I eventually did. Except I did. Weeks turned into months. The interviews I did get never led anywhere. I'd spend days preparing, researching the company, practicing answers. And then I'd sit in reception, waiting rooms, feeling my confidence drain away before anyone even spoke to me. The rejections came in waves, all saying the same thing in slightly different language. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Your experience doesn't quite match what we're looking for. We had a very strong field of applicants. The structure of my days began to collapse. I started waking up later because there was no reason to get up early. I'd make coffee and check my email obsessively, refreshing every few minutes even though I already knew nothing would be there. The flat became smaller somehow, the walls closer. I'd spend hours online scrolling through job sites, telling myself I was being productive when really I was just avoiding the growing panic. Sarah tried to be supportive at first. She'd ask how the job search was going in this carefully neutral tone, like she was afraid of setting me off. She'd tell me something would come up, that I just had to keep trying. But there's a difference between patience and faith, and I could feel the latter calcifying into something harder. She stopped talking about the future, holidays we might take, places we might move to, started focusing on immediate costs instead. Did we really need Netflix and Spotify? Should we switch to a cheaper phone plan? Could we cut back on takeaways? She never directly accused me of anything, but the unspoken anxiety settled into the flat all the same, hovering in every conversation about money. I felt it in the way she'd look at me when I was still on the sofa at 2 p.m, in the way her face would tighten when another rejection email came through. We stopped having sex, stopped really talking, just existed in parallel, waiting for something to change. When she eventually said she needed space, it came without drama. No shouting, no thrown accusations. She just sat down one evening and explained, very calmly, that she felt like everything had stalled, that she couldn't live in this suspended state anymore, not knowing when or if things would improve. She said she still cared about me, but that she needed to think about her own future. I didn't argue. How could I? She was right. I understood her point far too well to pretend otherwise. She moved out in December, a week before Christmas, took her stuff over 3 trips in a hired van, and each time she came back for another load, the flat looked more wrong. After she left for the last time, I walked through the rooms and realized how much of what made the place feel like home had been hers. Not just physical things, but the rhythm of daily life, the routines that had been keeping me anchored. After that, the flat felt strangely hollow, not empty. All my stuff was still there, but hollow, like a shell. Days stretched in uncomfortable ways. I'd lose track of time, look up from my laptop, and realize it was dark outside and I hadn't eaten. Nights became longer than they had any right to be. I'd lie awake listening to the pipes click and the radiators clank, and the distant traffic hum outside, aware that time was passing but unable to measure it properly. 3 a.m. felt the same as midnight, felt the same as 5 a.m. It was during those nights that I started spending more time online, not doing anything in particular, just scrolling. Reddit mostly, Twitter, YouTube. It gave my thoughts somewhere else to sit, something to focus on besides the growing certainty that I'd fucked up my life beyond repair. I've always been comfortable with computers, the sort of competence that comes from familiarity rather than talent. I'm not a programmer or anything, but I understood how information connected, how people left traces of themselves behind without realizing, how easy it was to build a picture of someone's life if you knew where to look. Social media, public records, cross-referencing details. At the time, that knowledge felt harmless, academic even. Something I'd never imagined using outside of work. The idea came to me one night in late January, while scrolling through Reddit, half asleep, in a thread about alternative ways of making money online. Most of the suggestions were predictable and useless. Match betting, dropshipping, taking surveys for pennies. But one comment stood out precisely because it didn't try to sell anything. The person mentioned, very casually, that there were research opportunities on the dark web for people who were good at gathering information. They said it with such matter-of-fact certainty that I found myself reading it again and again. They'd included a link, not directly to anything illegal, just instructions on how to access hidden services. I told myself I was only curious when I clicked it. Told myself the same thing as I read the instructions, downloaded Tor, and spent an hour figuring out how to navigate to a site that looked disappointingly normal. Plain, text-heavy, functional, like a really bad version of Craigslist from 2004. The pages were stripped down, lacking any visual noise. Forums dominated most of the space, filled with long threads discussing services and reputations in tones that were unsettlingly professional. It didn't feel like a criminal underworld, more like a parallel bureaucracy, governed by its own rules and expectations. People talked about vendors the way you talk about contractors, rating their reliability, their communication, how quickly they delivered. I spent several nights just reading, telling myself that observation didn't count as participation, that I was just curious about how this world worked. Eventually, I came across a listing looking for what they called a data coordinator. The description was vague, but not mysterious. They needed someone to collect publicly available information about named individuals and compile it into clear, organized reports. Basic research skills required. Attention to detail, discretion. What made me stop and really consider it was one phrase: publicly available information. That detail became the hinge on which all my justifications rested. I told myself that if I wasn't hacking or breaking into anything, then it wasn't really wrong. I'd just be organizing data that already existed. The digital equivalent of putting scattered papers into a folder. Anyone could do this if they knew where to look. I'd just be doing it more efficiently. The pay was reasonable, but not extravagant. A few £100s per report. That made it feel legitimate somehow, like a real job rather than something shady. I spent several nights deliberating, checking my bank account, looking at the bills piling up. Then, around 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, I applied. 2 days later, I received my first request. It came through an encrypted message, just a name and a general location in Leeds. Nothing else. No context, no explanation of why they wanted the information. I remember staring at it for a long time, expecting to feel a sense of alarm that never came. The work itself unfolded with surprising ease. Social media provided an outline of the man's life. LinkedIn showed where he worked. Public records filled in the gaps. Electoral roll. Company's house. Land registry. With enough patience, routines began to emerge naturally. Patterns that were invisible in isolation but obvious when viewed together. He went to the same gym 3 times a week, had lunch at the same cafe on Fridays, posted about football on Twitter every weekend. When I finished, I'd assembled a detailed portrait of a stranger's life, where he lived, where he worked, how he spent his time, what car he drove, who his friends were. I sent the report through the same encrypted channel and waited, feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. What if it wasn't good enough? What if I'd missed something obvious? What if they decided I wasn't up to the task? The payment arrived the next day. Bitcoin, converted to pounds and deposited into my account. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. Not just about the money, though that mattered. It was about feeling useful again, competent, like I still had value, like I could still do something well. For the first time since losing my job, I felt like I could breathe properly, like maybe I wasn't completely worthless. More requests followed quickly, 1 or 2 a week at first, then more. I developed templates, checklists, shortcuts. The work became routine. methodical rather than improvisational. I could complete a basic profile in a few hours now, a detailed one in a day. The people I researched stopped being individuals and became just data points, collections of habits and timestamps, numbers on a spreadsheet. I didn't let myself think about what the information might be used for. Debt collection, maybe. Private investigators. Background checks. I told myself it was probably nothing sinister. Just boring commercial stuff. And even if it wasn't, well, I was only gathering information that was already public. I wasn't doing anything illegal. Not technically. By March, it had become my primary income. I was making more than I had at the agency, working from home in my pajamas. I stopped sending out job applications, stopped checking recruitment sites. This was working. Why go back to a 9-to-5 when I could do this? The first disruption came in late April. I received a request marked as urgent, accompanied by a payment significantly higher than usual. Double my normal rate, transferred up front. The name was Emma Hartley. The location was Stockport. That was it. No other details. No explanation for the urgency or the premium. I noticed both things, the urgency, the money, and still I chose not to ask why. Curiosity had already been replaced by necessity. Or maybe I just didn't want to know. Emma's digital footprint was extensive in a way that now feels painfully intimate to recall. She was a nurse, worked night shifts at Stepping Hill Hospital. Her Instagram was public, full of selfies and pictures of her morning runs. Fitness apps revealed her exact running routes, the time she went, how long each run took. Facebook showed her shift patterns. She'd post about having a rough night at work, about looking forward to days off. Location tags placed her at specific cafes, specific parks, specific pubs. By the time I finished the report, I knew her routines with a familiarity that felt wrong even as I was compiling it. I knew she ran at 6 in the morning on her days off, that she stopped at the same Starbucks afterward, that she lived alone in a ground floor flat, that her car was parked on the street because the building didn't have dedicated spaces, that she usually worked Tuesday through Thursday nights and had her phone on Do Not Disturb during the day because she needed to sleep. I sent the report and told myself not to think about it, tried to push it out of my mind. But something felt different this time. The amount of detail I'd gathered, the precision of her patterns, the fact that someone had paid double to get this information quickly. 3 weeks later, I was drinking coffee and half watching TV when I opened the Manchester Evening News on my phone. The headline hit me like a punch to the stomach. Stockport nurse missing after night shift. There was a photo. Emma Hartley, the same face I'd been staring at for hours while building her profile. I read the article 3 times, 4 times. She'd left work at 7:30 in the morning. Her car was still in the hospital car park. She hadn't answered calls or messages. Colleagues were worried. Police were investigating. The details aligned too closely with what I'd documented. The hospital, the shift pattern, the usual time she'd leave. I told myself it was coincidence. Had to be. People go missing all the time. It didn't mean anything, couldn't mean anything, because admitting otherwise would have meant confronting a responsibility I was not prepared to face, would have meant acknowledging that I'd helped someone do something terrible. I avoided my computer for several days, didn't check messages, didn't take any new requests, but financial reality eventually pushed me back to work because fear alone doesn't stop bills from arriving. And I had rent due, council tax, electricity. I couldn't afford to stop. The message that followed didn't come through the usual system. It arrived directly, somehow, in my regular email, which should have been impossible. I'd been careful about keeping things separate, used different devices, different networks. But there it was, in my inbox, with no sender name. Just a subject line. Excellent work. The message praised my discretion and attention to detail. Said they had a special project that required someone with my particular skills. 5 individuals across the Northwest. Profiles needed within a week. The figure attached was more than I'd earned in the previous 2 months combined. Before I could even respond, before I could think about whether to accept, half the payment transferred into my account. That was when I understood, fully and clearly, that whatever legitimacy I'd imagined no longer existed. This wasn't debt collection or background checks. This was something else entirely. Something I should walk away from, should go to the police about, should refuse absolutely. I accepted anyway. The task involved 5 people, 3 in Manchester, 1 in Liverpool, 1 in Bolton. Each profile required a level of detail that went far beyond my previous work. Not just routines and locations, but vulnerabilities, security systems, household layouts, family members, financial situations. I spent that week in near isolation, barely sleeping, working obsessively, accessing databases I should never have seen, combining information in ways that made me increasingly uneasy. I knew what I was doing by then, couldn't pretend otherwise, but I kept going because I'd already taken half the payment and because stopping would have meant admitting to myself what I'd already become. When I sent the final report, the remaining payments arrived within minutes. Looking at my bank balance, I felt briefly untouchable, like I'd gotten away with something, like I was smarter than everyone else. That feeling lasted less than a week. News reports started appearing. A break-in in Didsbury, fraud case in Liverpool, an assault in Bolton. Each one aligned too closely with the profiles I'd created to dismiss as coincidence. The break-in happened at exactly the time I'd identified as optimal, when the residents were at their weekly evening class. The fraud targeted accounts I'd specifically noted were vulnerable. The assault victim was attacked on the route I'd mapped as isolated and poorly lit. I stopped reading after the 3rd incident. By then, denial felt more dishonest than knowing. I tried to stop. Stopped responding to messages. Stopped checking the encrypted channels. Told myself I was done. That I'd made enough money to last a few months. That I could go back to looking for legitimate work. That I could pretend the last few months hadn't happened. Then things got strange. My account started behaving oddly. Emails disappeared from my inbox. Ones I'd definitely received. Ones I'd read multiple times. My phone started doing things I couldn't explain. Opening apps on its own. The camera light coming on when I wasn't using it. Messages I'd sent vanishing from my conversation history. Then came the message, short and direct. You are either an asset or a liability. Choose wisely. The photograph arrived the next morning. It showed me sitting at my desk, face illuminated by my laptop screen, taken from outside the flat. Through the window, at night, the angle suggested it was taken from the street, maybe from a car. The timestamp was from 2 nights earlier. I'd been alone in the flat, thought I was safe, thought I was anonymous. Seeing myself from that perspective made something inside me collapse, because it demonstrated, with brutal clarity, how easily the same techniques I'd used on others could be applied to me. I knew my own patterns, knew my routines, knew exactly how vulnerable I was. And now someone else knew them too. I went to the police the next day, walked into the nearest station and told them I needed to report a crime. When they asked what had happened, I said I wanted to report myself. They arrested me that afternoon, took my laptop, my phone, everything. Interviewed me for hours across multiple days. I told them everything. Every request I'd taken, every profile I'd built, every piece of information I'd gathered. Showed them how to access the forums, how the payment system worked, everything I knew about the people I'd worked for, which wasn't much. I cooperated completely, not because I expected leniency, but because I no longer believed in the possibility of undoing what I'd already set in motion. They charged me with multiple offenses: conspiracy, computer misuse, data protection violations. The solicitor they assigned me said I'd probably get prison time. Said cooperation would help, but wouldn't erase what I'd done. I told him I understood. Now I'm waiting for my court date. Still in the same flat, still going through the same routines, but watching them with an awareness that didn't exist before. The police reassure me that the people I worked for are unlikely to pursue me further, that reporting them was the right thing to do, that I'll be safe. But reassurance doesn't erase knowledge. I know how these profiles are built, know how much information exists about any given person if you know where to look, know how patterns emerge from seemingly innocuous details, know how easy it is to map someone's entire life if you're patient enough. I know how patient the people who use this information can be, how they can wait weeks, months, for exactly the right moment, how they think in longer timescales than normal people do. And I know that somewhere, it's entirely possible that my life exists as a document, neatly organized, comprehensively detailed, created using the same methods I once relied upon. Someone knows where I live, where I shop, what time I usually go to sleep, which window doesn't lock properly, which neighbors are home during the day, when the police patrol this street. That knowledge doesn't fade with time. You'd think it would. You'd hope that eventually you'd stop checking over your shoulder, stop flinching at unexpected noises, stop analyzing every stranger who walks past your building. But it doesn't work that way. It just sinks deeper, becomes part of you, sits there in the dark where you can't quite see it, but you always know it's there. Every time I hear footsteps in the hallway, every time a car idles outside for too long, every time my phone does something unexpected, every time I'm alone in the flat late at night, waiting, always waiting. Sophie handed in her essay with that slightly smug expression she always wore when she thought she'd done something clever, sliding the printed pages across my desk with deliberate casualness, like she was passing state secrets rather than GCSE coursework. I was marking media studies assignments at home in Birmingham that evening when I got to hers and stopped reading after the first paragraph, just staring at the pages for about 10 minutes straight. The students always think they're the first ones to discover it, like they've stumbled across some secret that previous generations never found. The assignment was straightforward enough. Investigate how information spreads online and evaluate the reliability of different digital sources. Most students picked safe topics like social media misinformation or how news travels through messaging apps, standard teenage analysis of platforms they already understood. Sophie had decided to explore what she called the hidden internet, places where information exists outside normal search results and social media feeds. She had this habit of tucking her hair behind her left ear when she was concentrating, and I could picture her doing exactly that while typing this essay, convinced she was breaking academic ground that no teacher had ever considered. Her essay described discovering communities and content that operated beyond the reach of regular browsers and conventional oversight. She wrote about it with the casual confidence of someone who assumed she was the first person to encounter these concepts, explaining hidden services and anonymous networks as if she were pioneering digital anthropology. What bothered me wasn't her choice of topic, but the specific details she included about content she'd accessed while researching. screenshots of sites hosting material that definitely wasn't appropriate for a school project, descriptions of communities discussing activities that were obviously illegal. The essay included references to live streaming sites that showed what she described as real events happening in real time. Not entertainment content or news broadcasts, but unfiltered documentation of activities that people wanted to keep private from normal observation. She'd analyzed the technical aspects of these streams with surprising sophistication, discussing video quality, audience interaction features, and geographic indicators that suggested some content was being produced locally rather than in distant countries. Most concerning was her casual mention of recognizing locations in some of the streams, buildings and spaces around Birmingham that she could identify from architectural details or background elements visible in the footage. I found myself reaching for my laptop to close it, to put Sophie's essay aside and mark something safer. But something about her description of recognizing local locations made me curious despite my better judgment. That evening, I researched some of the sites Sophie had mentioned. The process of reaching these hidden sites was more complex than regular browsing, requiring specific software and careful attention to security practices. Sophie's essay had included enough technical details for me to follow her research methodology, though I told myself I was just verifying whether her claims were accurate. What I found confirmed that Sophie had accessed content that was genuinely disturbing. The streaming sites showed feeds from various locations that appeared to be monitored without the knowledge of people using those spaces. Not public surveillance cameras, but hidden monitoring of private areas where people assumed they weren't being observed. Most locations looked like commercial or industrial spaces, basements, warehouses, converted buildings being used for activities that required privacy. I found myself leaning closer to the screen, straining to hear the faint background sounds that accompanied the video feeds. Distant traffic, the hum of ventilation systems, occasionally footsteps echoing in empty corridors. What made me pay closer attention was recognizing some of the architectural details Sophie had mentioned. Victorian brickwork, industrial fittings, window designs characteristic of older buildings around Birmingham. I'd lived in the city long enough to identify these features as typical of converted warehouses in areas like Digbeth and the Jewellery Quarter. One location appeared regularly, a basement space with distinctive period features suggesting it was in a Victorian commercial building. The camera angle captured most of the room, but occasionally something would move just outside the frame, a shadow or the suggestion of movement that made me realize these weren't empty spaces being monitored for security purposes. I should have closed the laptop then, should have stopped following Sophie's research methodology and focused on how to address her inappropriate internet usage through proper school channels. But I kept watching, telling myself I needed to understand the full scope of what she'd discovered. The basement's architectural details were specific enough that I could potentially identify the building through local historical records. After narrowing down possibilities to about a dozen buildings, I decided to walk past the most likely candidates during my weekend. Most buildings I identified were occupied by legitimate businesses, but one stood out because it appeared mostly vacant despite being in a desirable commercial area. The ground floor had retail space, but upper floors showed no signs of occupancy, and basement windows were covered from inside. I walked past several times over the next week, observing at different times. Most of the time it looked empty, but occasionally I'd notice vehicles that weren't there regularly, or lights in what appeared to be the basement level. Bright, harsh illumination visible around window edges. One evening, I found an envelope on my kitchen table Not slipped under the door, on the table where I'd left my keys and wallet after coming home from school. Someone had been inside my house while I was there, moving through my home quietly enough that I hadn't heard them from the living room where I'd been marking papers. Inside was a printed copy of Sophie's essay with certain sections highlighted in red. The parts where she'd mentioned recognizing local locations and analyzing geographic indicators. On the final page was a handwritten note. Curious teachers make excellent research assistants. I spent the rest of the evening checking every window and door, trying to work out how someone had entered without me noticing. But I also couldn't stop thinking about that phrase, research assistants, and what exactly they might want me to research. The next day at school, I tried to act normally while observing Sophie more carefully. She seemed exactly the same. Confident, slightly rebellious, focused on completing assignments with minimal effort. During lunch break, I noticed someone waiting outside the school gates who didn't look like a parent or staff member. They were positioned where they could see both entrances, observing rather than waiting for someone specific. After about 20 minutes, they left, but their presence felt connected to the note about curious teachers. 3 days later, I saw the same person outside the supermarket near my house, standing by the car park entrance with the same careful observation posture, not following me directly, but making sure I understood that my movements were being monitored. That afternoon, I decided to speak with Sophie about her research and whether she'd had unusual contact from people interested in her work. Her response was casual. A few people had messaged her online expressing interest in her research methods, but she'd assumed they were fellow students or academics. She showed me the messages on her phone. Friendly, professional inquiries about how she'd accessed certain sites and whether she'd be interested in sharing additional findings. But something about their tone made me uncomfortable. Too knowledgeable about technical aspects, too familiar with specific sites Sophie had accessed. I tried to explain that people operating illegal surveillance networks might not appreciate students writing school essays about their activities. She seemed to understand my concerns, but pointed out that she'd only accessed publicly available sites, hadn't obtained information through illegal methods. Over the next few days, I found myself paralyzed by indecision about contacting the police. Every time I reached for the phone, I'd think about explaining how I discovered the surveillance sites, whether my own investigation might be considered problematic. Then I'd think about Sophie potentially being in danger because I was too cowardly to report what I knew. But I was also afraid that people who could enter my house without detection might take additional steps to ensure teachers didn't become problems for their activities. A week later, Sophie didn't show up for school. Her parents called to report she'd left home at normal time, but never arrived for registration. Police were notified immediately, search procedures initiated, but there was no obvious explanation for where she might have gone. I should have mentioned her research project and the possibility that her internet activities had attracted unwanted attention. But I couldn't bring myself to explain how I knew about illegal surveillance sites without implicating myself in the investigation. Sophie has been missing for 6 weeks now. The police investigation continues, but no trace has been found despite extensive searches and media appeals. Sometimes I still check the surveillance sites, telling myself I'm looking for evidence that might help the investigation. Last week, I saw movement in one of the basement feeds. A figure that could have been the right height and build, hair that might have been the same shade as Sophie's. The orange glow from the sodium lights outside seeped through the gap in my cheap curtains, painting the grimy wall a sickly yellow. It was always there, a constant, dull throb against the night, much like the ache in my chest. Swindon, a town of roundabouts and endless grey skies, had become my cage. The hum of the nearby electrical substation vibrated through the floorboards, a low, persistent drone that had long since burrowed into my skull, a soundtrack to my quiet desperation. I was Martin, 34, and the sum total of my existence could be measured in the growing stack of overdue bills on my kitchen counter and the ever-present gnaw of a failed relationship that had left me with less than nothing. My fingers, stained faintly with the grease of a forgotten takeaway, hovered over the keyboard. The screen, a harsh blue rectangle in the gloom, displayed a website I'd stumbled upon a few weeks prior. It wasn't the usual eBay or Gumtree. This was different, darker, an echo of the internet's underbelly, whispering promises of easy money. Shadow Market, the banner proclaimed in a stark white font, a name that felt both illicit and alluring. I'd told myself it was just curiosity, a morbid fascination with the digital fringe. But the truth was, the bank statements didn't lie. My account balance was a flat line, and the prospect of a bailiff at my door was becoming less a fear and more an inevitability. The first item I bought was a tablet, sleek and black, advertised as barely used. The price had been absurdly low, a fraction of its retail cost. My rationalization then had been simple. Someone probably dropped it, damaged the box, and couldn't return it. A simple resale, a quick profit. I'd listed it on a mainstream site, added a modest markup, and it sold within hours. The surge of adrenaline, the satisfying ping of the notification, had been intoxicating. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover a utility bill, a tiny reprieve from the suffocating pressure. This small success had opened a door. The website became my secret addiction, a clandestine marketplace where I could momentarily escape the reality of my failing life. I started small, a smartphone here, a smart speaker there, always cheap, always quick to sell. The money trickled in, enough to keep the wolves from the door, to buy another tasteless ready meal, to keep the electricity flowing. Each successful transaction, each anonymous buyer, chipped away at the thin veneer of my conscience. I wasn't stealing, I reasoned. I was just a middleman, an entrepreneur in a digital age, navigating the grey areas. The laptop I bought next was a high-end model, practically brand new, for a price that made my heart pound. It arrived in plain packaging, no discernible return address, just like all the others. I booted it up, planning to wipe it clean before reselling. But a flicker of curiosity, a rare indulgence, made me pause. The previous owner hadn't bothered to erase their files. A photo opened, a young woman smiling, her arm around a man with a booming laugh. They stood before a brightly painted carousel, their faces alight with joy. I felt a prickle of unease. It wasn't a family portrait, not exactly. It was a holiday snap, vibrant and full of life, a stark contrast to the sterile, anonymous transaction that had brought the machine to my desk. I quickly deleted the files, wiping the hard drive with a professional-grade program, telling myself it was simply good practice. No loose ends. Weeks bled into months, marked by the arrival of packages and the satisfying chime of payment notifications. My flat, once a shrine to my own melancholic isolation, began to fill with a transient inventory. Boxes stacked in corners, devices charging on every available surface, a silent testament to my burgeoning illicit enterprise. The hum from the substation seemed to grow louder, or perhaps it was just the ringing in my ears, a constant reminder of the tightrope I walked. Then came the tablet. It was another top-of-the-range model, still in its original sealed box, listed for an unbelievably low price. The seller's handle was a string of random characters, as most were, offering no clue to their identity. When it arrived, I noticed a small dent on one corner of the box, barely perceptible. Inside the tablet was pristine. I powered it on, intending to factory reset it immediately. But a lock screen appeared, displaying a wallpaper, a selfie of a young girl no older than 10, with bright, inquisitive eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Her name, Chloe, was emblazoned across the top of the screen in a playful, childish font. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. Chloe. The name resonated with a faint, unsettling familiarity. I'd seen it somewhere recently. My fingers trembled as I navigated to a news website, typing "Missing Persons UK" into the search bar. The results flooded my screen. And there she was, Chloe Davies, missing from a small town in Wiltshire, just a few hours' drive from Swindon. Her photograph, identical to the one on the tablet's lock screen, stared back at me. The article spoke of a frantic search, heartbroken parents, and a police appeal for information. The air in my flat grew heavy, thick with unspoken accusations. The hum of the substation became a roaring in my ears. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to vomit. My pragmatism, my carefully constructed facade of a legitimate reseller, shattered. This wasn't just cheap electronics. This wasn't just a dodgy side hustle. This was something far, far worse. I remembered the laptop, the couple at the carousel. I remembered a smart watch I'd sold a week earlier, its fitness tracker still logged into an account under the name Mark. Mark Harrison, a man reported missing from Birmingham, his case widely publicized. I had dismissed it then, a mere coincidence, a trick of a tired mind. But now, the coincidences piled up, forming a gruesome tapestry of stolen lives, not just stolen goods. My hands shook, slick with a cold sweat, as I scrolled through the shadow market listings. Each item, once a potential source of income, now felt like a bloodied trophy. I saw a watch, a distinctive gold chain, a pair of custom-made headphones. Each piece of hardware, a chilling breadcrumb leading back to a life abruptly interrupted. I was complicit. I was part of it. I had been moving evidence, unknowingly, for weeks. The thought made my stomach clench. I had to do something. My first instinct was to delete everything, to scrub my digital footprint clean. But that wouldn't erase what I'd done, what I'd seen. It wouldn't bring Chloe back. I stared at the tablet, Chloe's innocent face beaming at me from the screen. My fingers, still trembling, typed out an email to the police. It was anonymous, carefully worded, detailing how I'd come across the device, omitting any mention of shadow market, painting myself as an unwitting recipient. I provided the serial number, the details of Chloe's photo. Then I deleted the email, closed the browser, and disconnected the router. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the constant hum that had filled my flat. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Sleep became a distant memory. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren sent a jolt of terror through me. I imagined them knocking on my door, their faces grim, their questions pointed. My carefully constructed world of self-deception had imploded, leaving me exposed and terrified. A week passed. No police, no arrests. No news reports linking my email to any breakthrough in Chloe's case. Had they dismissed it? Was my anonymous tip lost in the deluge of other, less credible leads? The uncertainty was a torment. I started to question my own sanity. Had I imagined the coincidences? Had my debt-ridden brain conjured a narrative of horror to justify my own failings? Then an email arrived. It wasn't from the police. It was from one of my previous customers, a woman who had bought a digital camera from me months ago. The subject line read, "Regarding the camera." My blood ran cold. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. "I need to speak to you urgently about the camera you sold me," the email began. "There are some unusual photos on it. Photos of places I recognize, and a face I recognize from the news." A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. She had traced it back to me. How? I had always used burner emails, VPNs, and anonymous shipping labels. I had covered my tracks meticulously. Or so I thought. My phone rang. The number was blocked. I stared at it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't answer. It rang again, and again. The persistent buzzing was like a drill boring into my skull. I switched off my phone, pulling the plug from the router, plunging my flat into an even deeper digital silence. But the silence didn't bring peace. It brought a suffocating sense of impending doom. I was exposed. The anonymity I had so carefully cultivated had failed. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I barely ate, barely slept. Every shadow held a lurking threat. Every sound a potential harbinger of discovery. I peered through the gaps in my curtains, watching the car park below, half expecting to see a police car, a figure in a trench coat. My own reflection in the window seemed alien, gaunt, eyes wide with a terror I could no longer suppress. I knew I couldn't hide forever. The woman who had bought the camera, she knew. And if she knew, others could too. The network I had been a part of, the shadows I had moved through, were now closing in around me. The knock came just before dawn. 3 sharp, authoritative raps that echoed through the silence of my flat. My breath hitched. I froze, my heart thundering. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just listened, straining for any sound, any clue. Another knock, louder this time. "Police!" A voice boomed from the other side of the door. "Open up, Mr. Davies." Mr. Davies? My name wasn't Davies. I felt a flicker of confusion, a tiny, fleeting moment of reprieve before the full weight of the situation crashed down on me again. They had the wrong name. Or did they? Had I been so careless? The door rattled as a heavy shoulder struck it. The cheap lock groaned in protest. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly weak. This was it. The end of my quiet, desperate enterprise. The reckoning. I heard the splintering of wood, the sharp crack of the doorframe giving way. Figures in dark uniforms burst into my flat, their faces grim, their movements swift and precise. The beam of a powerful torch cut through the gloom, momentarily blinding me. "Martin Hayes," one of them demanded, his voice devoid of inflection. I could only nod, my throat dry, my tongue thick. "You're under arrest." They cuffed me, the cold metal biting into my wrists. I offered no resistance. What was the point? My life, my carefully constructed facade had crumbled. As they led me out, past the scattered boxes, past the glowing embers of my laptop, I glanced back at the screen. It had powered itself on somehow, displaying the Shadow Market homepage. And there it was, a new listing, prominently displayed, a fresh face on the scrolling banner. My face, my own hollow-eyed face, staring out from the digital abyss. Below it, a chilling single word: available. The orange glow of the sodium light still seeped through the shattered doorway, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent, swirling testament to the quiet complicity of survival and the moral erosion that had consumed me. The hum of the substation, for the first time, seemed to fade into a distant whisper, replaced by the deafening roar of my own terror. Recently, I learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is satisfy your curiosity. That clicking the wrong link at the wrong time can change everything about how you see the world, and more importantly, how the world sees you. I'm a librarian at the University of Manchester, spending my days cataloguing books and helping students find obscure references for their dissertations. My relationship with computers extends about as far as checking emails and the occasional Netflix binge. But after my divorce last year, I found myself with far too much time on my hands and a flat in Chorlton that felt uncomfortably quiet most evenings. It started innocently enough. A colleague mentioned something called the dark web during our lunch break, describing it as this hidden internet where you could find anything. She was talking about buying prescription medications without a prescription. Nothing sinister, just trying to get around the ridiculous waiting times at her GP. The way she described it made it sound like some sort of digital black market, accessible but mysterious. I suppose I was bored more than anything else. After spending another evening watching repeats of Location, and finishing a bottle of Malbec on my own, I decided to have a look. How difficult could it be? The Tor browser was surprisingly easy to download. Within about 20 minutes, I was browsing what looked like a much seedier version of the regular internet. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Drug marketplaces, fake IDs, stolen credit card details. The sort of thing that made me feel like I was doing something mildly rebellious without actually breaking any laws, just by looking. I spent a few evenings casually browsing, more fascinated by the structure of it all than interested in buying anything illegal. There were forums discussing everything from cryptocurrency to conspiracy theories. It felt like being an anthropologist studying some underground culture, safely removed from any real danger. Then I found the entertainment section. Most of it was what you'd expect: pirated films, illegal streaming sites, that sort of thing. But there were other categories too: live streams, private shows, interactive content. The prices were listed in Bitcoin, which meant nothing to me, but the descriptions were becoming increasingly disturbing. I should have stopped there. I know that now. But there's something about forbidden knowledge that makes it irresistible, isn't there? Like being told not to look down when you're standing at the edge of a cliff. The red room listings were buried several clicks deep in a section that required additional verification to access. The name itself should have been warning enough, but I'd convinced myself I was just exploring, just satisfying intellectual curiosity. The descriptions were vague, but clearly implied live-streamed violence. Real people, real harm, real-time interaction from viewers who could influence what happened. I told myself I'd never actually watch one. I was just researching, trying to understand how such things could exist. But the more I read about them, the more fascinated I became. Not by the violence itself, but by the infrastructure. How did they operate? Who were the people involved? How did payment systems work? How did they avoid law enforcement? The forum discussions were the most disturbing part. Users would discuss previous shows, like they were reviewing films on IMDb. They had favorite performers, they made requests, they shared technical tips for better streaming quality. They spoke about human suffering with the casual enthusiasm of hobbyists discussing model railways. I started checking the forums more regularly, not daily, but every few days. I told myself I was conducting research, maybe even gathering information that could be useful to authorities. Really, I think I was just drawn to the darkness of it all, the same way people slow down to stare at car accidents. After about a month of this casual browsing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the regular forum users had a location tag that said Manchester, UK time zones in their posts, references to local news events. This wasn't some anonymous figure operating from Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia. This was someone nearby, someone who might shop at the same Tesco as me, someone who might have been sitting next to me on the bus. I started paying more attention to their posts. They were a frequent contributor, offering technical advice about streaming setups, discussing upcoming shows, sharing what they called reviews of past events. Their username was Viewer1, and they seemed to have some sort of insider knowledge about how these operations worked. Then they posted something that made me shut my laptop immediately. They mentioned a location, not specifically, but descriptively, an abandoned industrial building near the canal, somewhere in the direction of Trafford Park. They were discussing technical challenges with soundproofing and internet connectivity, complaining about the difficulties of operating in such locations while maintaining security and anonymity. I recognized the area they were describing. I'd walked past it several times during my weekend runs along the canal towpath. A derelict textile factory that had been empty for years, surrounded by overgrown wasteland and partially collapsed outbuildings. The sort of place you'd expect to find used needles and broken glass, not sophisticated streaming equipment. For several days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I tried to focus on work, my mind would drift back to that forum post. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as fantasy, someone making up stories for internet points. But the technical details were too specific, too practical. This read like someone with genuine experience, not someone spinning elaborate fiction. I decided to walk past the building on my next weekend run. Just to look, just to satisfy my curiosity. If it looked completely abandoned and undisturbed, I could put the whole thing out of my mind. If there were signs of recent activity, well, I hadn't decided what I'd do then. The factory was about 3 miles from my flat, nestled between the canal and a section of wasteland that the council had been promising to develop for years. I'd run past it dozens of times before without paying much attention. It was just part of the landscape, another piece of Manchester's industrial heritage slowly rotting away. But this time, I looked more carefully. The main building was 5 stories of red brick and broken windows, exactly the sort of structure that would normally be completely inaccessible to anyone without climbing equipment. But around the back, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs, was a section where the ground floor windows had been carefully boarded up, rather than just smashed. The boards were weathered, but looked more recent than the general decay of the building. More concerning were the subtle signs of recent human activity. A section of grass that had been flattened by foot traffic, cigarette butts that weren't yet soggy from multiple rainfalls, a section of chain link fence that had been cut and carefully repositioned to look intact from a distance. I stood there for probably 20 minutes, pretending to stretch after my run, while actually studying the building. No obvious security cameras, but that didn't mean much. No sounds from inside, but the walls were thick brick that would muffle most noise. No vehicles parked nearby, but there were several access routes that would allow discreet arrival and departure. I should have called the police. I should have reported my suspicions and let trained investigators handle whatever was happening. Instead, I went home and checked the forums again. Viewer 1 had posted an update. They were planning another show for the following weekend, Saturday night, sometime after midnight. They mentioned improved audio quality, better camera angles, and special interactive features for premium subscribers. The casual tone of the post, discussing human suffering like a product launch, made me feel physically sick. I spent the entire week in a state of anxious distraction. My colleagues at the library noticed I was distant and distracted. I caught myself staring out the window during meetings, my mind replaying forum posts and imagining what might be happening in that abandoned building. Friday night, I barely slept. I kept checking the forums, watching for updates, looking for any indication that I'd misunderstood something. But Viewer One continued posting technical updates and responding to questions from other users. Everything suggested that something was definitely planned for the following evening. Saturday evening, I tried to distract myself with normal activities. I cooked dinner, watched television, started reading a book, but by 11 o'clock, I couldn't concentrate on anything except what might be happening just a few miles away. I put on dark clothing and walked to the canal. I told myself I was just going to observe from a distance, maybe document anything suspicious and report it to authorities on Monday morning. I wasn't planning to intervene directly or put myself in danger. The towpath was completely deserted, which wasn't unusual for a Saturday night in October. The streetlights were spaced far apart, creating long stretches of shadow between pools of orange light. By the time I reached the factory, it was nearly midnight. The building looked exactly the same as it had during my daytime visit, but now there were subtle signs of activity. A faint glow from one of the upper floor windows, barely visible behind what looked like blackout material. The sound of a generator running somewhere inside, so quiet it was almost masked by ambient city noise. I found a position behind some overgrown shrubs where I could watch the building without being easily spotted. The generator sound continued, joined occasionally by other mechanical noises I couldn't identify. Once, I thought I heard voices, but I might have been imagining it. Around 1 o'clock, a van arrived. It parked behind the building, in an area not visible from the main road. 2 figures got out and entered through what must have been a rear entrance. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of people following a familiar routine. 30 minutes later, another vehicle arrived, then another. By 2 o'clock, there were 4 vehicles parked behind the building, all positioned to avoid casual observation. I should have left then. I should have gathered whatever evidence I could and reported it to authorities. Instead, I found myself moving closer to the building, trying to find a position where I might be able to see or hear more clearly. The rear of the building had several ground floor windows that were boarded up, but not completely sealed. Through gaps in the boards, I caught glimpses of artificial light and shadows moving inside. The generator noise was louder here, joined by the hum of electronic equipment and occasional voices. I was crouched behind an old shipping container, probably 30 yards from the building, when I heard footsteps approaching from behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering, expecting to see security guards or police officers. Instead, I saw a figure in dark clothing, walking directly towards my hiding position with obvious intent. They weren't trying to be stealthy. They knew exactly where I was. The figure stopped about 10 feet away and spoke in a quiet, conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than any aggressive challenge would have been. They told me I'd been expected. They said Viewer One had noticed unusual traffic patterns in the forums, someone asking the right questions and showing interest in specific locations. They'd been monitoring forum users more carefully lately, tracking digital footprints and cross-referencing with local activity. They explained that I'd been identified and followed during my previous visit to the building. My regular forum browsing had created a profile that made me interesting to them. someone with genuine curiosity, but no obvious law enforcement connections. They offered me a choice. I could walk away immediately, delete my forum accounts, and never return to this area or these websites. Or I could satisfy my curiosity completely, see exactly what I'd been researching, and become part of their community. They made it sound like a reasonable business proposition. They weren't threatening me with violence, just explaining my options with the calm professionalism of someone making a sales pitch. But the implication was clear. Walking away would require their trust that I'd remain silent about what I'd discovered. Staying would require my participation in activities I'd only observed from a distance. I stood there in the darkness, 30 yards from a building where I suspected horrible things were happening, being offered a choice between complicity and silence. Neither option felt like escape. I told them I needed to think about it. They said I had until the next Saturday to decide. They gave me a secure messaging app and an encrypted contact. They said Viewer One was particularly interested in meeting me, someone who'd shown such dedicated research interest in their work. I walked home in a state of shock that I'm still not sure I've recovered from. The casual professionalism of the encounter was almost more disturbing than any direct threat would have been. They spoke about human suffering like a business operation, about my potential involvement like a job interview. It's been 3 weeks since that conversation. I haven't returned to the forums. I haven't used the contact information they gave me. I've avoided running anywhere near that area of the canal. But I haven't called the police either, because part of me knows they were right about one thing. I had been researching their activities with genuine fascination, not just horror. I had been drawn to the forbidden knowledge, the glimpse into darkness that most people never see. They hadn't completely misread my motivations, and because another part of me knows that if they were sophisticated enough to identify and track me through forum activity, they're probably sophisticated enough to monitor whether I contact authorities. The choice they offered me probably wasn't as simple as they made it sound. I still check my usual websites. I still go to work at the library. I still run along different sections of canal, avoiding the area near Trafford Park. I try to maintain normal routines and convince myself that the whole experience was some sort of elaborate hoax or misunderstanding. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about Viewer One's invitation, about what exactly I might learn if I satisfied my curiosity completely, about whether the line between observer and participant is as clear as I'd always assumed. The secure messaging app is still installed on my phone. The encrypted contact information is still saved in my notes. Every Saturday evening, I find myself wondering what choice I'm actually going to make. Have you ever left a review online? I used to, occasionally, when something seemed worth commenting on. A restaurant that was particularly good or notably disappointing. A shop that went above and beyond or completely failed to deliver. Nothing elaborate, just a few stars and a couple of sentences. The sort of casual feedback that takes 30 seconds to write and then you forget about it. Last year, I left one review that was slightly more critical than usual. Still perfectly reasonable, I thought. Just honest about a meal that hadn't lived up to expectations. That's it. That one review is the reason I can't use my real name online anymore. Why I've closed all my social media accounts, and why I still receive anonymous messages containing photographs of my house taken from angles I didn't know were possible. I'm a dental hygienist working at a private practice in Cambridge. Been there for about 6 years now. I live in a terraced house on the outskirts of the city with my partner Rachel and our 2 cats. We're both in our early 30s, reasonably settled. The sort of people who have mortgage payments and pension contributions and think about things like garden maintenance. Normal, boring, exactly the kind of life where a restaurant review shouldn't matter at all. The restaurant in question was a new place that opened near the city centre last year, marketed as fine dining with a Mediterranean fusion concept. Rachel had booked us a table for our anniversary, drawn in by the glossy website and the promotional reviews from local food bloggers. The meal cost nearly £200 for the two of us, expensive by our standards, but supposedly worth it for a special occasion. The experience was disappointing from the start. We waited 40 minutes past our booking time to be seated. The food was mediocre at best. Nothing like the elaborate dishes shown in the website photos. My main course arrived barely warm, and when I mentioned it to the waiter, he shrugged and said the kitchen was busy. Rachel's meal had ingredients listed on the menu that simply weren't present on the plate. We left feeling we'd wasted money we couldn't really afford on an evening that was meant to be memorable for better reasons. A few days later, I wrote an honest review on one of the major restaurant review websites. I explained what we'd experienced, noting the long wait, the quality issues, the dismissive service. I wasn't cruel or personal about it, didn't name staff members or use inflammatory language. I just described what had happened and said I wouldn't recommend the restaurant based on our visit. I gave it 2 stars out of 5, which seemed fair given the price and the promises they'd made. The review was posted under my real name, which the platform required for verified reviews. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It was just a restaurant review, the sort of consumer feedback that businesses should expect when they charge premium prices and under-deliver. I'd left dozens of reviews over the years for various businesses, all under my real name, never having any issues. Within days, I started receiving messages. They came through various platforms, the review website itself, my Facebook account, my email address, even my LinkedIn profile, which I barely used. The messages all followed a similar pattern, accusing me of lying about my experience, suggesting I was trying to damage a small business unfairly, demanding I remove my review immediately. Some messages were more aggressive than others. A few contained thinly veiled threats about consequences if I didn't take the review down. Others tried a different approach, claiming the restaurant owner was a single mother struggling to build a business, and my review was personally devastating to her family. The tactics varied, but the goal was always the same. They wanted my review deleted. I initially assumed these messages were from the restaurant owner or staff members, upset about negative feedback. It's not uncommon for businesses to respond defensively to criticism, even if it's legitimate. I reported the more threatening messages to the platforms they came through and otherwise tried to ignore them. My review was honest, and I had no intention of removing it just because someone didn't like what I'd written. Then the messages started including personal information, details about where I worked, which dental practice employed me, what time my shift typically started. One message mentioned my partner by name and described the car she drove. Another referenced our house, giving the street name and mentioning the distinctive blue door we'd painted the previous summer. That's when I started feeling genuinely concerned. These weren't just angry business owners or defensive staff. Someone had researched me extensively, gathering information from various sources to create a detailed picture of my life. The messages made it clear this information wasn't just passively collected. It was intended to intimidate me, to make me feel watched and vulnerable. I reported everything to the police. They took a statement, but explained that unless someone made explicit threats or engaged in sustained harassment that met legal thresholds, there wasn't much they could do. Sending messages that mentioned publicly available information wasn't itself illegal, however unsettling it felt. They advised me to make my social media accounts private and be cautious about my online presence. I did exactly that, locking down all my accounts and removing as much personal information as I could find. I also noticed that my restaurant review had accumulated dozens of comments, all attacking my credibility and character. People I'd never heard of claimed I was a competitor trying to sabotage a legitimate business. Others said they'd seen me behaving badly at the restaurant and that I'd invented my complaints. The comments were clearly coordinated, all posted within a short time frame, all using similar language patterns. What I didn't understand was why a restaurant would go to such lengths over a single negative review. The place had other reviews, some positive and some critical like mine. It wasn't as though my one review could destroy their business, especially since other customers had mentioned similar experiences. The response seemed wildly disproportionate to the perceived offense. Rachel suggested I just delete the review to make the whole situation go away. Part of me wanted to, just to stop the messages and get back to normal life. But another part felt stubborn about not being bullied into removing honest feedback. We compromised by me contacting the review platform to explain what was happening and asking if they could hide my personal information while keeping the review active. The platform support team was sympathetic but limited in what they could do. They removed my last name from the review and disabled comments on it, but they couldn't completely anonymize it without violating their verification policies. They also mentioned that several other reviewers who'd criticized this particular restaurant had reported similar harassment, suggesting this was part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident. That information should have made me feel less alone, but instead it worried me more. If multiple people were being targeted like this, it suggested the restaurant had resources and systems in place for dealing with negative reviews that went far beyond normal business responses. It implied organization and deliberate strategy rather than just emotional reactions to criticism. About 3 weeks after the harassment started, I discovered my home address had been posted on the dark web. A colleague at work who had some technical knowledge helped me access the relevant sites after I explained what had been happening. She showed me how to navigate these hidden spaces, warning me that what I might find wouldn't be pleasant. My address was listed on a site that specialized in what they called reputation management services. The listing included my full name, home address, workplace, daily routine information, photos of my house and car, and detailed personal information about Rachel and me. It was presented as a dossier available for purchase, marketed to people interested in correcting what the site termed unjust online criticism of businesses. The listing made it clear what was being offered. For a fee, people could purchase access to comprehensive information about individuals who'd left negative reviews of certain businesses. The information could be used for various purposes, all of them designed to pressure reviewers into removing their criticism. The site didn't explicitly endorse harassment or violence, but the intended use was obvious from how the information was packaged and presented. My dossier had been purchased multiple times already. The site included a counter showing how many people had bought access to my information, and the number was in the 20s. 20 different people had paid money for detailed intelligence about my life, all because I'd left an honest review about a mediocre restaurant meal. But my information wasn't alone on the site. There were hundreds of similar dossiers, all targeting people who'd left negative reviews of various businesses across the UK. The site organized them by region and by the type of business reviewed. making it easy for restaurant owners or their representatives to find information about their critics. Some dossiers were more detailed than others, but they all included enough personal information to enable serious harassment or worse. The site also featured a messaging system where buyers could coordinate their activities. I could see discussions about my review specifically, with people planning how to pressure me into deleting it. Some suggested sending more threatening messages. Others proposed showing up at my workplace or home. A few discussed more subtle psychological tactics designed to make me feel unsafe without doing anything obviously illegal. Reading through these discussions was surreal and terrifying. These were real people, casually planning ways to intimidate me and disrupt my life, all over a restaurant review. The casual tone of their messages made it worse somehow. The way they discussed harassment strategies like they were planning a mild inconvenience rather than a campaign of psychological warfare. The police took this development more seriously. Evidence of organized harassment through dark web coordination met thresholds they could actually investigate. They seized my computer to document what we'd found and opened a formal investigation into the reputation management site and the people using it. The investigation revealed that the site was operated by a company offering what they marketed as online reputation services to businesses. For fees ranging from a few hundred to several £1,000s, they'd identify critics, compile detailed dossiers on them, and either harass them directly or provide information to clients who wanted to handle it themselves. The restaurant I'd reviewed was just one of dozens of businesses using their services. What made it particularly insidious was that the harassment was crowdsourced. The company would create the dossiers, but actual intimidation was carried out by multiple individuals who'd purchased access to the information. This made it extremely difficult to trace any single incident back to the company or the business that had commissioned the dossier. Each harassing message or threat could be dismissed as an isolated incident by a random internet user, even though they were all coordinated through the dark web marketplace. The company operating the site was eventually prosecuted, though the charges were complicated by the fact that they technically only provided information rather than directly engaging in harassment. Several individuals who'd purchased access to dossiers and sent threatening messages were also charged, but many remained anonymous and untraceable. The site itself was shut down, but police confirmed similar services continued operating elsewhere. My dossier presumably still exists in private collections of people who downloaded it before the site was closed. The photos of my house, the details about my routine, the personal information about Rachel, all of that is still out there somewhere, saved on devices I'll never identify, potentially being shared through networks I can't access. We moved house about 6 months after all this happened, not just because of the harassment, though that was certainly a factor. The knowledge that our home had been photographed and analyzed, that strangers had discussed showing up there, made it impossible to feel safe. Our new address is carefully guarded. We don't link it to our names online anywhere. We have security cameras. We're hyper-vigilant about maintaining privacy. I deleted the review eventually, not because the harassment achieved its intended goal, but because I wanted to remove any reason for people to continue targeting me. The review website understood and didn't penalize me for removing it. They also implemented new policies about protecting reviewers from retaliation, though I'm not sure how effective those policies can be given how much personal information is inherently shared when leaving verified reviews. What haunts me most is thinking about all the other people whose dossiers appeared on that site, most of whom probably never discovered they'd been targeted. How many honest reviewers faced harassment without ever understanding it was coordinated? How many deleted reviews under pressure without knowing about the dark web marketplace facilitating their intimidation? How many moved house or changed jobs, or lived in fear because they'd exercised their right to share legitimate consumer experiences? The restaurant closed down about a year after all this happened, not because of my review or anyone else's, but because they genuinely weren't very good. The space was taken over by a different restaurant that actually delivers on its promises and treats customers properly. I've never left a review for them, even though they deserved positive recognition. I can't bring myself to leave restaurant reviews anymore, can't participate in consumer feedback systems that should be helpful, but turned out to be dangerous. That's what I think about now when I see negative reviews online. Not whether they're fair or accurate, but whether the person who wrote them has any idea what they might have exposed themselves to. Whether their honest feedback about a disappointing meal or poor service has resulted in their home being photographed, their routine being documented, their personal information being compiled and sold to strangers who view intimidation as a business service worth paying for. I left a bad review once. Just one honest assessment of a genuinely poor experience at a restaurant that charged premium prices and delivered mediocre results. That review led to organized harassment, dark web dossiers, personal threats, and ultimately having to move house and reconstruct our digital lives. All because I thought consumer feedback was meant to be honest and that businesses should be accountable for the experiences they provide. The asymmetry of it still bothers me. A restaurant can take your money, serve you poorly, treat you dismissively, and you're supposed to just accept it. But if you honestly describe what happened in a review, you become a target. Your home gets photographed, your routine gets analyzed, your life gets disrupted by people who view your criticism as an attack that justifies retaliation. I've learned to stay silent now, to keep my opinions private, to avoid participating in the feedback systems that theoretically make markets more efficient and businesses more accountable. It's safer that way, less vulnerable, though it means bad businesses continue operating without the public accountability they deserve. That's what they want, of course. That's the entire purpose of services like the one that targeted me, to silence honest criticism through intimidation and make consumers afraid to share their genuine experiences. So I stay quiet now, and I suspect many others do too after experiencing similar harassment. We move through our consumer lives pretending everything is fine, leaving only positive reviews, if we leave any at all, never mentioning when we've been disappointed or mistreated. Not because businesses have improved, but because we've learned that honesty has consequences that extend far beyond a simple online review. That restaurant review cost me £200 for a mediocre meal, and thousands of pounds in moving costs, security systems, and psychological counselling. It cost me my sense of safety in my own home and my willingness to participate honestly in consumer feedback systems. All for being truthful about an experience that genuinely happened, written in measured language, posted where such reviews are meant to be shared. I left a bad review once, and I'll never make that mistake again. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment everything started to go wrong, but I still can't explain why I didn't see it coming. Maybe that's just how these things work. You don't recognize danger until you're already caught up in it. This happened about 10 months ago when I was living in Birmingham, working as a veterinary nurse at a small practice in Moseley. The job was demanding but rewarding, lots of long days, but I genuinely enjoyed the work. I'd been there for about 3 years, had a decent little flat near Cannon Hill Park, and life was generally ticking along without any major complications. I've never been particularly tech savvy, but I'm not completely hopeless either. I can navigate the internet well enough, understand basic privacy settings, that sort of thing. So when I read an article about the dark web one evening, I wasn't entirely clueless about what it was. The article was talking about how journalists and activists used it to communicate safely in countries with oppressive governments, how it wasn't all illegal marketplaces and criminal activity, like the media often portrayed it. The article mentioned that ordinary people could access it fairly easily, that it wasn't this incredibly complex thing requiring specialist knowledge. Out of curiosity more than anything else, I looked into how to do it, found some straightforward instructions, followed them, and within maybe 20 minutes I was browsing this completely different version of the internet. Most of it was boring, honestly. Pages that wouldn't load properly, sites that looked like they'd been designed 15 years ago and never updated, broken links everywhere. I spent an hour or so clicking around, not finding anything particularly interesting. There were some marketplaces that looked obviously dodgy, a few discussion boards I had no interest in, and a lot of dead ends. Then I found something called the Witness program. It was listed on one of those directory pages that catalog dark websites. The description was brief. Help provide testimony for those who cannot speak for themselves. Confidential, anonymous, essential. When I clicked through, the page that loaded was plain but well designed. Black background, white text, a simple logo showing an eye. The homepage explained what the program was about, and it sounded genuinely noble. Essentially, it was a platform designed to collect witness testimonies about crimes and injustices that couldn't be reported through official channels. The site explained that many people around the world witnessed terrible things but couldn't come forward because of fear, corruption, lack of access to legitimate authorities, or various other reasons. The Witness program aimed to document these testimonies anonymously, creating a permanent record that could potentially be used for justice in the future. The site emphasized that witnesses remain completely anonymous. No real names, no identifying information, just accounts of what people had seen or experienced. The testimonies were stored securely and could be accessed by verified human rights organizations, journalists, and legal professionals who might be able to use them to build cases or expose wrongdoing. It all seemed legitimate and important. There was a button at the bottom. Submit your testimony. I didn't have anything to submit. I'd never witnessed any serious crimes or injustices. But I was curious about what the process looked like, so I clicked through anyway. A form appeared asking for basic information about the incident you wanted to report. Date, location, type of incident. A detailed description of what you witnessed. There were drop-down menus for categorizing the testimony: human rights violations, corruption, assault, theft, environmental crimes, and various other options. At the bottom was a field for providing contact information if you wanted to receive updates, though the site stressed this was entirely optional. I closed the form without filling anything in. I had nothing to report, and I wasn't going to make something up just to see how the system worked. But as I was about to close the browser, I noticed another link at the bottom of the page. Become a witness validator. I clicked it. The page explained that the program needed volunteers to help verify and categorize submitted testimonies. Because the system allowed anonymous submissions, there was a risk of false reports or spam. Validators would review testimonies, assess whether they seemed credible, and help organize them appropriately so they could be useful to the organizations that accessed them. The page stressed that validators never had access to identifying information about witnesses. Everything remained anonymous. Validators simply read testimonies and provided their assessment of credibility, completeness, and relevance. Each validation earned points, and volunteers who accumulated enough points could receive recognition for their contribution to documenting human rights abuses and supporting justice. It sounded like something I could actually help with. I had no useful skills for activism or advocacy, but I could read testimonies and provide honest assessments. It seemed like a small but meaningful way to contribute to something important. I registered using a temporary email address. The process was simple. A few questions about languages I spoke, regions I was familiar with, any relevant experience or knowledge. I put down English, UK, and mentioned my work as a veterinary nurse, since some testimonies might involve animal welfare. Then I submitted the registration and was taken to a dashboard. The interface was clean and straightforward. At the top was my point balance, 0. Below that was a list of pending testimonies waiting for validation. Each one showed a reference number, a date, and a brief category label. There were dozens of them. I clicked on the first one. The testimony appeared in a simple text box. It was written in English, describing an incident of workplace harassment. The person writing it explained they'd witnessed their manager verbally abusing an employee over several weeks, creating a hostile environment, but the company's HR department had dismissed complaints. The testimony was detailed and specific, including dates and descriptions of particular incidents. Below the testimony were several questions I needed to answer. Does this testimony appear credible? Yes, possibly unclear, no. Is the testimony sufficiently detailed? Yes, partially no. Is the testimony relevant to the stated category? Yes, partially no. Does the testimony require follow-up or additional information? Yes, no. I read through the testimony again carefully. It seemed genuine. The details were consistent, the writing style was natural, and nothing about it raised obvious red flags. I marked it as credible, sufficiently detailed, and relevant. Didn't think it needed follow-up since the account was fairly complete. Then I submitted my validation. My point balance increased slightly. A new testimony appeared. This one was different. Written in broken English, describing what sounded like labor exploitation in a factory somewhere in Eastern Europe. The details were vague, the timeline unclear, but the emotional tone felt genuine. I marked it as possibly credible, partially detailed, relevant, but requiring additional information. Another testimony appeared, then another, then another. Most were fairly mundane, honestly. Workplace disputes, minor corruption, petty theft. Things that were unpleasant but not shocking. I spent maybe an hour going through them, providing my assessments, earning points slowly. Then I came across one that made me pause. The testimony described witnessing an assault, a serious one, with enough detail that it made me uncomfortable to read. The person writing it explained they'd seen someone being attacked in a car park late at night, that the victim had been badly hurt, and that the witness had been too frightened to intervene or report it to police. The testimony included descriptions of the attacker, the victim, the location, the approximate date. I sat staring at the screen for a while. This wasn't workplace harassment or minor corruption. This was a violent crime, and someone had witnessed it but hadn't reported it, and now they were telling their story to this anonymous platform instead. I marked it as credible, sufficiently detailed and relevant, added a note suggesting it should be flagged for organizations that dealt with violent crime. Then I submitted the validation and tried not to think too much about what I just read. I kept validating testimonies over the next few days. Did maybe an hour or two each evening, working through the backlog, earning points steadily. Most testimonies were relatively minor things, but occasionally I'd come across something more serious. Assaults, thefts, fraud, abuse. Each time, I tried to assess them objectively, provide honest evaluations, and move on. After about a week, my point balance had reached around 500. I noticed a notification at the top of my dashboard. You are now eligible for priority validation tasks. These testimonies require experienced validators and earn additional points. There was a button, Access Priority Tasks. I clicked it. A new list of testimonies appeared, and immediately I could see these were different. The first one I opened described witnessing a murder, an actual murder, described in disturbing detail. The witness explained they'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had seen something they weren't supposed to see, and had been living in fear ever since. The testimony included specific information about the location, the people involved, the circumstances. It read like something that should be in a police report, not on an anonymous website. I marked it as credible. What else could I do? The details were too specific to be fabricated. The fear in the writing felt genuine. I submitted the validation and moved to the next testimony. More serious crimes, more disturbing accounts, witnesses describing things they'd seen that had clearly traumatized them, things they claimed they couldn't report through official channels for various reasons: corrupt police, fear of retaliation, immigration status, involvement in illegal activities themselves. The testimonies were increasingly detailed. Locations were specific, often down to street names and landmarks. Descriptions of people involved included physical features, clothing, sometimes even names. Dates and times were precise. I kept validating them because that's what I'd signed up to do. Each one earned me more points. Each one felt more serious than the last. Then I came across a testimony that mentioned Birmingham. It described a violent incident that had allegedly occurred in Digbeth about 2 months earlier. The witness claimed to have seen a group of men attacking someone near the railway arches, that the victim had been badly beaten and left unconscious, that the witness had fled before police arrived. I read through it twice. The location was specific enough that I could picture it. I'd been to that area before, though not recently. The description of the incident was detailed and consistent. Nothing about it seemed obviously false. I marked it as credible and submitted my validation. More testimonies appeared mentioning Birmingham. Different locations, different incidents, but all local. Some I recognized the places mentioned, others I didn't. All claimed to describe serious crimes, assaults, robberies, drug deals gone wrong. All allegedly witnessed by people who hadn't reported them to police. I started wondering why so many testimonies were suddenly from Birmingham. Coincidence? Or was the system somehow showing me testimonies relevant to my location because I'd mentioned UK in my registration? Then I got a testimony that made my stomach drop. It described an incident near Cannon Hill Park, my park, the one I walk through regularly. According to the testimony, someone had witnessed a woman being followed by a man as she walked home one evening, about 3 weeks earlier. The witness claimed the man had been acting suspiciously, maintaining distance but clearly tracking the woman's movements. The witness had considered intervening, but had been uncertain whether they were misreading the situation. They'd watched the woman reach her building safely, then seen the man stand outside for several minutes before leaving. The description of the location was extremely specific. The building was described in enough detail that I was fairly certain it was mine. The date mentioned was a Tuesday evening 3 weeks ago. I walked home through that park most Tuesday evenings after my late shift. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence. Lots of women walked through that park. Lots of buildings in the area matched the description. It didn't have to be about me. But the details kept matching up. The time was right. The day was right. Even the description of the woman was vague enough. that it could have been me. Average height, dark coat, carrying a bag. I marked the testimony as credible because I couldn't think of any reason to doubt it. If someone really had witnessed this and thought they'd seen something suspicious, their testimony seemed genuine. Then I submitted the validation and sat there feeling cold. Someone had been following me 3 weeks ago, and someone else had witnessed it happening. And now I was reading about it on a dark website. I checked the date stamp on the testimony. It had been submitted 2 days ago. Whoever witnessed this had waited 3 weeks before reporting it anonymously to this platform. Over the next few days, more testimonies appeared mentioning the same area. Different incidents, different dates, but all near Cannon Hill Park or the surrounding streets. Someone witnessing suspicious behavior near the entrance to my building. Someone seeing a person sitting in a parked car outside for extended periods. Someone noticing the same individual walking past the same locations repeatedly over several days. Each testimony was written by a different anonymous witness. Each described something that seemed innocuous on its own, but felt threatening when combined with the others. And I was the one validating them, marking them as credible, confirming that yes, these testimonies seemed genuine. Yes, they were sufficiently detailed. Yes, they were relevant to their stated categories. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, looking for people who seemed to be watching or following me, checking if anyone was sitting in parked cars near my building, taking different routes home, varying my schedule. I didn't see anything obviously suspicious, but then the testimonies suggested the surveillance had been subtle enough that witnesses had been uncertain whether they were really seeing something wrong. Then a new type of testimony started appearing. These ones were different in tone. Instead of describing incidents they'd witnessed, they were describing people they'd seen. Detailed descriptions of individuals, including what they were wearing, where they'd been seen, what they'd been doing. One of them described me. I'm certain of it. Average height, dark hair, works in veterinary medicine, lives near Cannon Hill Park, usually walks home around 8 on Tuesday evenings. The testimony claimed to have seen this person exhibiting suspicious behavior, though it didn't specify what that behavior was. I was being documented, catalogued. Multiple anonymous witnesses were submitting testimonies about me, and I was validating them alongside dozens of other testimonies, confirming they seemed credible and detailed. I tried to stop validating, logged out of the dashboard, and didn't go back for several days. But I couldn't stop thinking about those testimonies, about who was submitting them and why. When I finally logged back in, my dashboard had been updated. There was a new section, testimonies requiring your attention. Inside were dozens of testimonies, all flagged as priority, all mentioning Birmingham, all describing incidents near my home. And there was a message at the top. As a validator familiar with this region, your input on these testimonies is particularly valuable. Please review and validate at your earliest convenience. They knew where I lived, not just the general area, but specifically. They were assigning me testimonies about my own neighborhood, about incidents I might have witnessed, about surveillance of places I frequented. I went through the testimonies mechanically, each one describing something that had allegedly been witnessed near my home. People loitering, cars parked suspiciously, someone trying door handles on my street late at night, a person photographing buildings including mine. Each testimony was dated within the past few weeks. Each was submitted by a different anonymous witness, and each was detailed enough to be credible, specific enough to be verifiable, disturbing enough to be frightening. I validated them all because I didn't know what else to do. Marked them as credible, as detailed, as relevant. Then I submitted the validations and watched my point balance increase. The next day, I noticed someone outside my building. A woman, maybe in her 40s, standing on the pavement across the street. She was looking at her phone, but her attention kept drifting to my building. She stood there for maybe 20 minutes before walking away. That evening, a new testimony appeared. It described witnessing a woman standing outside a building near Cannon Hill Park, appearing to watch the entrance. The testimony noted the date and time. That afternoon, the description of the woman matched the person I'd seen. I hadn't submitted that testimony. I'd witnessed it, but I hadn't reported it. Someone else had, which meant there were multiple people watching my building. Some of them were the ones being watched. Others were the ones doing the watching and reporting what they saw. More testimonies appeared over the following days, each describing activity around my neighborhood, each mentioning dates and times that corresponded with my own observations. Sometimes the testimonies described things I'd seen. Sometimes they described things I hadn't noticed, but that had allegedly happened nearby. Then testimonies started appearing that described me specifically, not just vague descriptions that might match dozens of people, but specific details. My work schedule, the practice where I worked, my car, including the make and color, routes I regularly walked, shops I visited. Each testimony claimed to have witnessed me exhibiting concerning behavior, returning to the same locations repeatedly, speaking to people in suspicious circumstances, carrying items that seemed unusual. None of it was true, but the testimonies were written convincingly enough that they seemed credible, and I was still validating them, still marking them as detailed and relevant, still contributing to this documentation of my own life being compiled by anonymous witnesses. I tried to delete my account. The option wasn't available. I looked through every settings page, every menu option. There was no way to remove my account or stop receiving validation tasks. I sent a message through the site's contact system, demanding they remove my information. No response came. The testimonies kept appearing. More details about me, more specific information about my movements, my habits, my routines, all submitted anonymously by witnesses who claimed to have seen suspicious behavior. Then testimonies started appearing that described things that hadn't happened yet, predictions of where I would be seen next, suggestions of what behavior I might exhibit in the future, recommendations for how witnesses should respond if they encountered me. Someone was planning something, using this platform to coordinate surveillance, to document my life, to build a narrative that I was somehow suspicious or dangerous. I went to the police, told them people were following me, documenting my movements, posting about me online. They asked for evidence. I tried to explain about the dark website, about the testimonies, about the validation system. They looked at me like I was paranoid. They said they'd make a note of my concerns, but there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence of harassment or threats. They suggested I keep a diary of suspicious incidents, maybe install a camera, consider speaking to a mental health professional if the anxiety became overwhelming. I moved out of Birmingham 2 months later, found a job at a practice in Coventry, got a flat in a completely different area. Didn't tell anyone where I was going except my new employer. For a few weeks, everything seemed fine. No testimonies appeared mentioning my new location. The validation tasks I received were about other places, other people. I started to relax. Then a testimony appeared describing someone matching my description being seen in Coventry, working at a veterinary practice, living in a specific neighborhood, exhibiting the same suspicious patterns of behavior that had been documented in Birmingham. they'd found me again. More testimonies appeared. My new address, my new routine, my new regular locations, all being documented by anonymous witnesses, all being validated by volunteers who had no idea they were contributing to organized surveillance, volunteers like I had been. I stopped logging into the site, but the damage was done. My information was in their system. My life was being documented by dozens of anonymous witnesses, all submitting testimonies that painted me as suspicious, as dangerous, as someone who needed to be watched. And somewhere, other validators were reading those testimonies and marking them as credible, just like I'd done, contributing to a system they didn't understand, helping to document people they'd never met, building cases against individuals for reasons they couldn't comprehend. I don't know who's behind the witness program. I don't know what they want or why I was targeted. I don't know if I'm the only one or if there are others being documented the same way. What I know is that I helped build the system that's now being used against me. Every testimony I validated, every assessment I provided, I was training myself and others to accept these accounts as credible, to treat anonymous witnesses as reliable, to document people's lives without question. And now those same mechanisms are being used to document mine. I've moved 3 more times since Coventry. Each time, within days, testimonies appeared describing my new location. Each time, the documentation starts again. The witnesses multiply. The details accumulate. I can't escape it because I can't escape witnesses. Anyone could be one. Anyone could be watching, documenting, submitting testimonies about me to that platform. The woman at the bus stop, the man in the car park, the person walking their dog past my building. Anyone. I probably shouldn't be telling you this. Even now, months later, I find myself looking over my shoulder when I walk to the corner shop or checking the locks twice before bed. But I suppose someone should know what happened, and writing it down makes it feel less like something I imagined. It started with boredom, really, the kind of restless curiosity that hits you when you're stuck in a bedsit in Birmingham with nothing but a laptop and too much time on your hands. I'd been made redundant from my job at the council offices, and whilst I was applying for new positions during the day, the evenings stretched endlessly ahead of me. I'd heard about the dark web, of course. Everyone has. The hidden internet where you can supposedly find anything if you know where to look. Not that I was after anything particularly sinister. I wasn't trying to buy illegal substances or hire an assassin. I was just curious about what was actually there, beneath all the sensationalist headlines and urban legends. Getting access wasn't as complicated as I'd expected. A few searches on regular Google led me to the necessary software, and within an hour I was browsing sites with addresses that looked like random strings of letters and numbers. Most of it was disappointingly mundane. Forums discussing privacy, marketplaces selling perfectly legal items, and a lot of broken links. But there was one site that caught my attention. It had a simple black background with white text, and it was called The Registry. At first glance, it looked like some sort of directory or database. The homepage was sparse, just a search box, and a brief description explaining that it was a comprehensive listing service for various purposes. I spent several evenings browsing through the registry's categories. There were sections for services, products, information exchanges, all described in deliberately vague language that could have meant anything. It reminded me of classified ads from local newspapers, the sort where people advertise household items for sale, but use oddly formal language that makes you wonder what they're really offering. The section that drew me in was labeled simply as personal records. When I clicked on it, I found what appeared to be a vast collection of detailed profiles. Each entry contained a photograph and extensive personal information: full names, addresses, daily routines, family members, workplace details, even seemingly random observations about habits and preferences. I initially assumed these were fictional profiles, perhaps for creative writing projects or role-playing games. The level of detail was impressive. One entry described a woman named Sarah Thompson from Leeds, including her regular coffee shop, her mother's maiden name, her habit of leaving her kitchen window slightly open overnight, and the fact that she always took the same route home from her job at a local library. The photographs looked genuine rather than stock images. They showed ordinary people going about their daily business: a man unlocking his car, a woman walking her dog, someone collecting post from their doorstep. The quality suggested they'd been taken with a decent camera from a reasonable distance, not the blurry surveillance footage you might expect. What made me uncomfortable was how current everything seemed. The clothing in the photos looked contemporary, and many of the entries included recent details like started new position at Morrison's last month, or recently moved to ground floor flat due to mobility issues. These weren't historical records or fictional creations. They appeared to document real people living real lives right now. I started searching for familiar names, just out of curiosity. I tried my own name first, then my former colleagues from the council office. Nothing came up for me, but I found an entry for Trevor Walsh, who'd worked in accounts before I was made redundant. His profile included his home address in Erdington, details about his divorced status, and even mentioned that he'd started wearing reading glasses in the past year. The photograph showed Trevor walking out of our old office building. I recognized the distinctive red brick facade and the car park where I used to eat my lunch. The image had clearly been taken some time after I left, because Trevor was wearing a jacket I'd never seen him in before. I should have stopped looking then, should have closed the laptop and found something else to occupy my evenings. But there's something compulsive about discovering information you're not supposed to have access to. It's like reading someone else's diary or overhearing a private telephone conversation. Morally questionable, but difficult to resist. I began searching for other people I knew, my former neighbors, old school friends, relatives I'd lost touch with over the years. Most searches came up empty, but occasionally I'd find a match that made my skin crawl. My cousin Linda appeared in the database. She lived in Wolverhampton with her husband and 2 teenage daughters, and according to her profile, she was struggling financially since her husband's hours had been cut at the factory. The entry included photographs of her house, not just the street view, but images that appeared to have been taken from her back garden, showing the kitchen window and the door to her utility room. More disturbing still was a section titled Behavioral Observations. This contained detailed notes about Linda's routines, written in a clinical, detached style. It mentioned that she usually left for work at 8:15, that she had a habit of checking her phone while waiting for buses, and that she often stayed up late watching television when her family had gone to bed. I wanted to warn Linda, but how could I explain how I discovered this information? How do you tell someone that their private life is being documented by strangers on the dark web without admitting that you've been browsing these sites yourself? Instead, I kept searching. I told myself I was gathering evidence, that I'd eventually find a way to report this to the authorities once I understood the scale of what I was looking at. But really, I think I was just horrified enough to be fascinated. The database was enormous. I could spend hours clicking through profiles of people from across the UK, each one containing intimate details about their lives, relationships, and vulnerabilities. There were elderly people living alone, single parents struggling to manage work and childcare, individuals dealing with health problems or financial difficulties. What struck me most was how ordinary these people were. These weren't celebrities or public figures whose lives might be considered fair game for scrutiny. They were postmen and shop assistants and retired teachers. People who'd never done anything to attract attention or invite surveillance. After about a week of browsing through the registry, I noticed something that made me stop clicking for several minutes. At the bottom of each profile page was a small line of text I'd previously overlooked. It read, "Last updated," followed by a date and timestamp. All the profiles I'd been viewing had been updated within the past month. Many had been updated within the past week. Some had timestamps from just days earlier. This wasn't historical data or information compiled from public records. Someone was actively maintaining these profiles, adding new photographs and updating personal details on a regular basis. Someone was watching these people, documenting their lives, and keeping meticulous records of their activities and habits. I started paying closer attention to the update timestamps. Linda's profile had been refreshed 3 days ago. Trevor's had been updated the previous afternoon. These weren't casual observations gathered occasionally. They were the result of systematic, ongoing surveillance. The implications were staggering. Hundreds, possibly thousands of ordinary people were being monitored without their knowledge. Someone was tracking their movements, photographing their homes, and building detailed databases of their personal information. I began to wonder about the purpose behind all this surveillance. The registry wasn't presenting itself as a law enforcement database or a legitimate business directory. It existed on the dark web for a reason, and that reason clearly wasn't benevolent. The profiles reminded me of target assessments, the kind of detailed intelligence gathering that would be useful if you wanted to manipulate, blackmail, or harm someone. Each entry contained exactly the sort of information a stalker or burglar would find valuable. When people were home alone, which windows they left unlocked, what their financial vulnerabilities might be. One evening, whilst browsing through profiles of people from Manchester, I came across an entry that made me feel physically sick. The photograph showed a young woman I recognized from a true crime documentary I'd watched several months earlier. She'd been murdered in her flat last year, and the case had received significant media coverage because the killer had never been caught. But here she was in the registry, with a profile that had been created weeks before her death. The entry contained detailed information about her daily routine, her work schedule, and even mentioned that she often forgot to lock her patio door when she came home from evening shifts. The profile's final update had occurred 2 days before her murder. I stared at that timestamp for a long time, trying to convince myself there was some innocent explanation. Perhaps the database had been compiled from newspaper reports after the fact, or maybe the timestamps were inaccurate. But the level of personal detail in her profile was far more extensive than anything that had appeared in the media coverage of her death. I started searching for other names from news reports, focusing on unsolved cases from the past couple of years. I found 3 more matches, all victims of crimes that had attracted media attention, all with profiles that predated their deaths by weeks or months. The evidence was circumstantial but disturbing. Either the registry was documenting potential victims before crimes occurred, or it was being used by people who went on to commit those crimes. I should have contacted the police immediately, should have printed screenshots and taken my concerns to the authorities, regardless of how I discovered the information. but I was paralyzed by the implications of what I'd found and uncertain whether anyone would believe me. Instead, I kept returning to the registry night after night, compulsively searching for new entries and monitoring the updates to existing profiles. I told myself I was conducting my own investigation, but really, I think I was just trapped in a cycle of morbid fascination. Then, on a Thursday evening in late November, I searched for my own name again. This time, there was a match. My profile included my current address in Birmingham, a recent photograph of me leaving the local supermarket, and detailed information about my daily habits. The entry mentioned my recent redundancy, my evening walks to the corner shop, and even noted that I tended to stay up late using my laptop. The behavioral observations section contained information that no casual observer could have gathered. It mentioned that I usually left my bedroom window slightly open at night, that I had a habit of checking my phone immediately after waking up, and that I often ordered takeaway food on Friday evenings. Most disturbing of all was a note about my browsing habits. The profile mentioned that I spent considerable time online in the evenings and had recently begun accessing restricted areas of the internet. They knew I'd been using the dark web. They knew I'd found the registry. The timestamp showed that my profile had been updated that morning. I closed the laptop immediately and spent the rest of the evening checking the locks on my door and windows, peering through the curtains to see if anyone was watching the building. Every sound from the street made me jump, and I found myself wondering how long I'd been under surveillance without realizing it. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. I stopped going for evening walks and started varying my routine as much as possible. I ordered groceries online instead of visiting the shops, and I avoided using my laptop after dark in case someone could see the glow from my window. But I couldn't stop thinking about the registry and all those other profiles I'd seen. Hundreds of people were being watched and documented, and some of them might be in genuine danger. My own fear was insignificant compared to the broader implications of what I'd discovered. I decided to contact the police. I prepared a detailed statement explaining how I'd found the database, including screenshots and specific examples of profiles that corresponded with unsolved crimes. I even researched which department would be most appropriate for handling this kind of evidence. Before submitting my report, I decided to check the registry one final time to ensure my information was current and accurate. My profile had been updated again. This time, the entry included a note that I had been preparing to contact law enforcement authorities. It mentioned specific details about my planned report, including the names of the victims I'd identified and the evidence I'd gathered. The timestamp was from less than an hour earlier. Someone had been monitoring my online activities in real time. They knew exactly what I was planning to do, and they documented it in my profile before I'd even made my decision final. I deleted my prepared statement and closed my laptop. I've barely used it since, except to apply for jobs and handle essential business. I found new employment within a few weeks, and I've tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal routine, but I still think about the registry constantly. I wonder whether those profiles are still being maintained, whether new entries are being added, and whether the information is being used for the purposes I suspect. I wonder whether other people have discovered the database and what they've done with that knowledge. Most of all, I wonder whether my own profile is still there, still being updated with observations about my current behavior and activities, whether someone is still watching me, documenting my attempts to move on and forget what I found. I suppose I'll never know for certain. And perhaps that's the most disturbing part of all, the knowledge that this surveillance could continue indefinitely, invisible and undetectable, until someone decides to act on the information they've gathered. I've never tried to access the registry again, and I've no intention of doing so. But sometimes, when I'm walking to work or sitting in my flat in the evening, I catch myself wondering whether someone is watching me, adding new observations to my profile, noting my continued attempts to live a quiet, unremarkable life. The thought that my efforts to remain invisible might themselves be worth documenting is perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. Imagine thinking you're helping someone find their missing dog, and 3 months later discovering you've been part of something that makes your stomach turn every time you close your eyes. That's essentially what happened to me, though it took far longer than it should have for me to piece together what I'd actually been doing. I should probably explain how I ended up involved in the first place, though I'm still not entirely comfortable admitting how naive I was about the whole thing. Last spring, I was between jobs after being made redundant from my position at a marketing firm in Birmingham. The severance wasn't terrible, but it wasn't going to last forever, and I'd been putting off the inevitable return to job hunting by convincing myself I deserved a proper break after 15 years of office work. My mate Craig had mentioned in passing that he'd been earning a bit of extra cash doing odd jobs for people online. Nothing elaborate, just simple tasks that required someone local to handle things in person. Collecting parcels from collection points when people were away, checking on properties during holidays, that sort of thing. He made it sound straightforward enough, and the money wasn't insignificant for what seemed like minimal effort. The website he'd found these opportunities through wasn't anything I'd heard of before, but it looked legitimate enough. Clean design, proper contact information, testimonials from other users. The registration process required proof of identity and address, which actually reassured me that they were taking security seriously. Within a week, I'd been approved and had access to the job listings in my area. Most of the tasks were exactly what Craig had described: simple collection and delivery work, house-sitting arrangements, occasional help with moving furniture. The pay was decent, usually between £20 and £50 for a few hours' work, and the clients seemed genuinely appreciative. I found myself with a small but steady income stream that kept me occupied whilst I half-heartedly searched for proper employment. The request that changed everything appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning in late May. A woman named Sarah needed someone to help distribute missing pet flyers around various locations in and around Coventry. Her dog, a golden retriever called Max, had gone missing from her garden 3 weeks earlier, and despite her best efforts, she hadn't had any luck finding him. She was offering £40 for a day's work putting up posters and handing out flyers in busy areas. What struck me about the request was how desperate she sounded in her message. She explained that Max was getting on in years and needed medication for a heart condition. Every day he was missing reduced the chances of finding him alive. She'd already covered the immediate area around her home, but needed someone to extend the search radius to places she couldn't reach easily due to work commitments. I responded that same day, and Sarah got back to me almost immediately. She lived in a village outside Coventry and worked long hours at a care home, which explained why she needed help covering more ground. The plan was simple enough. She'd prepare packages of flyers and poster materials for specific locations, and I'd collect them from a designated pickup point and distribute them according to her instructions. The first collection point was a small industrial estate on the outskirts of the city. Sarah had left the materials in a weatherproof box behind a particular building, exactly where she'd said they'd be. Inside were several bundles of flyers with Max's photo and contact details, along with a roll of posters and some tape for putting them up on lampposts and notice boards. The distribution locations were clearly marked on a simple map she'd included. Shopping centres, parks, residential areas, train stations. All places where missing pet posters would be perfectly normal and where people might have seen a lost dog. I spent the better part of the day covering the route she'd outlined, putting up posters in prominent locations and handing out flyers to anyone who seemed receptive. It felt good to be doing something genuinely helpful for someone in distress. I'd had pets myself over the years and could imagine how frantic I'd be if one of them went missing. Sarah had included her mobile number on all the materials, and I found myself hoping she'd receive some useful calls as a result of the extended search area. She paid promptly through the website system and sent a grateful message thanking me for my thoroughness. She also mentioned that she was planning to expand the search even further and asked if I'd be available for similar work the following week. The money was useful, and I felt like I was making a genuine difference, so I agreed immediately. The second week followed the same pattern. Collection from a different industrial estate, this time closer to Leicester, with the materials for locations in that area. The flyers were identical to the previous week's batch, though Sarah had updated the missing date to reflect that Max had now been gone for nearly a month. She'd also increased the reward amount from £200 to £500, which suggested she was becoming increasingly desperate. I covered the Leicester route as thoroughly as I had the first one, and again Sarah seemed pleased with my work. Her messages were becoming more frequent though, and I could sense the growing anxiety in her words. She mentioned that she'd had a few calls from the first week's flyers, but none had led to any concrete sightings of Max. By the third week, I was starting to feel genuinely invested in the search. Sarah had expanded the operation again, this time covering areas around Nottingham and Derby. The collection points were always industrial estates or retail parks on the edges of cities, places where someone could leave materials without attracting attention. The routine had become familiar. Collect the packages, follow the prescribed routes, distribute everything according to her detailed instructions. It was during the fourth week that I first noticed something that seemed slightly odd. I was collecting materials from a car park behind a furniture warehouse when I saw someone else doing what looked like exactly the same thing I was doing. A middle-aged man was loading boxes from a similar weatherproof container into his car boot, and when he saw me looking, he gave me a nod that suggested mutual recognition of shared purpose. I didn't think much of it at the time. It made sense that Sarah would have recruited multiple people to help with the search, especially given how wide an area she was now trying to cover. If anything, it was encouraging to know that Max's disappearance was being taken so seriously and that Sarah had the resources to organize such an extensive effort. The following week brought another slight change to the routine. Instead of collecting from one location and covering one area, I was given materials for 3 different routes in 3 different cities. The packages were more substantial now, enough flyers and posters for several days' work, and the pay had increased accordingly. Sarah explained that she'd received some promising leads and wanted to saturate certain areas with as much coverage as possible, whilst the trail was still warm. I was happy to take on the extra work, and the money was definitely welcome. What I didn't expect was how organized the whole operation had become. Each package now included detailed schedules showing optimal times for different locations, priority areas marked clearly on the maps, and even suggestions for the most effective approaches to use when handing out flyers to members of the public. The level of planning was impressive, though it did make me wonder how Sarah was managing to coordinate all of this whilst working full-time at a care home. The schedules alone must have taken considerable research and preparation. But then again, people will go to extraordinary lengths when their beloved pets are missing. And perhaps she'd taken time off work to focus on the search effort. It was around the 7th week that I started encountering other people doing similar work with increasing frequency. Not just the occasional glimpse in a car park, but regular sightings of individuals following what appeared to be the same type of systematic approach I was using. Same weatherproof collection containers, same methodical distribution patterns, same professional-looking flyers and materials. At a shopping centre in Sheffield, I watched a woman spend 40 minutes covering the car park with the same methodical precision I'd been trained to use. At a train station in Leeds, I saw a man distributing what looked like identical materials to mine, though I was too far away to see the details clearly. The operation was clearly much larger than I'd initially realized. I began to pay more attention to the other people I encountered during my work, and a pattern started to emerge. We were all roughly the same demographic, middle-aged, professional-looking, the sort of people who would blend in easily in any environment, and who wouldn't attract suspicion when approaching strangers with flyers. We all worked with the same quiet efficiency, following our prescribed routes without deviation or apparent improvisation. The thought occurred to me that I'd never actually spoken to Sarah directly. All our communication had been through the website's messaging system, and whilst her messages were personal and emotional, I'd never heard her voice or had any contact that couldn't have been mediated through text. For someone supposedly desperate to find her missing pet, she seemed remarkably organized and systematic in her approach. I decided to do a bit of research into missing pets in the Coventry area. If Max's disappearance was genuine, there would likely be other online traces of the search effort. Social media posts, local newspaper coverage, appeals on community websites. Dogs don't just vanish without leaving some kind of digital footprint in today's connected world. What I found when I searched for missing golden retrievers named Max in the Coventry area was absolutely nothing. No Facebook posts, no local news stories, no appeals on community forums or lost pet websites. For such an apparently extensive and well-funded search operation, there was a complete absence of any other evidence that it existed. I expanded my search to include the surrounding areas and different variations of the dog's name and description. Still nothing. I tried searching for missing pets in the specific locations where I'd been distributing flyers, thinking perhaps Sarah had been less precise about the area in her communications with me. Again, no results that matched the information I'd been given. The absence of any corroborating evidence began to trouble me more than I wanted to admit. I told myself that not everyone uses social media to search for missing pets, and that Sarah might be a private person who preferred to handle the situation without public appeals. But the complete lack of any online trace seemed increasingly unlikely given the scale and organization of the operation I'd been participating in. I decided to take a closer look at one of the flyers during my next collection, examining it more carefully than I had before. The photo of Max was professional quality, the kind of perfectly composed portrait that suggested it had been taken in a studio rather than in someone's back garden. The contact information looked legitimate enough, but something about the overall presentation struck me as too polished for a genuine missing pet appeal. More concerning was what I noticed when I compared flyers from different weeks. Whilst the basic design remained the same, small details were subtly different from batch to batch. The reward amount varied. The missing date sometimes shifted by a few days, and in one case, I was certain the dog's age had changed from 8 years old to 10 years old between distributions. These inconsistencies could have been simple mistakes made by someone under stress, but they could also suggest something more troubling. I began to wonder if the materials I'd been distributing were being used to test different approaches or gather different types of response, rather than to genuinely search for a missing pet. The realization that I might not have been helping Sarah find her lost dog was disturbing enough, but it raised the question of what I had actually been doing during those weeks of systematic distributions. Why would someone want hundreds of people distributed across multiple cities to hand out materials that weren't what they appeared to be? What was the real purpose of such an elaborate and expensive operation? I started paying closer attention to the locations I'd been asked to cover, looking for patterns that might reveal the true intent behind the distributions. Shopping centers, transport hubs, residential areas near schools, places where families gathered. All locations where approaching strangers wouldn't seem suspicious, and where someone could observe interactions and responses without attracting attention. The possibility that occurred to me was too uncomfortable to initially accept, but it explained everything I'd observed: the systematic approach, the multiple operatives, the constantly shifting details on the materials, the focus on busy, family-oriented locations. Someone was using the missing pet story as cover for something that resembled surveillance or intelligence gathering on a significant scale. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. The dark web, which I'd only heard about in passing, supposedly contained marketplaces for all sorts of illegal activities. If someone wanted to gather information about people's routines, their responses to approaches from strangers, or their willingness to help in certain situations, this would be an almost perfect methodology. The missing pet angle was particularly clever because it encouraged people to provide detailed information about their own movements and observations. Anyone who responded to the flyers would likely share when and where they thought they might have seen the dog, essentially mapping out their own daily routines and favorite locations. Information that could be valuable to someone with less innocent intentions. I stopped accepting jobs from Sarah immediately, claiming I'd found full-time employment and was no longer available for freelance work. Her response was understanding but disappointed, and she asked if I knew anyone else who might be interested in helping with the continuing search. I politely declined to provide any referrals. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying attention to missing pet appeals with a new and uncomfortable awareness. How many of them were genuine, and how many might be sophisticated data collection operations? The thought that I'd unknowingly participated in something that could potentially be used to harm the same families I thought I was helping made me feel physically sick. I never reported my suspicions to the police because I had no concrete evidence that anything illegal had actually occurred. The materials I distributed were professionally produced and seemed legitimate on the surface. The payments I'd received were processed through official channels and properly declared for tax purposes. On paper, everything appeared entirely legal. But I know what I experienced during those weeks, and I know how systematic and extensive the operation was. I know that dozens of other people were doing exactly the same work I was doing, covering hundreds of locations across multiple cities with materials that contained inconsistent information about a dog that apparently never existed. I still think about Sarah sometimes, though I'm certain that wasn't her real name. I wonder if she was even aware of how her operation appeared to someone on the ground, or if the missing pet story was just another layer of deception in something much larger and more concerning. I wonder how many other people like me are still out there, thinking they're helping reunite families with beloved pets, whilst actually participating in something entirely different. The worst part is not knowing what the real purpose was, or what might have been done with whatever information was gathered through those carefully orchestrated distributions. I tell myself that perhaps it was market research or social psychology study, something benign that just used unusual methodology. But I can't shake the feeling that I was part of something much darker, something that someone had taken considerable trouble to disguise as an act of compassion. These days, I'm more careful about the jobs I accept and the people I trust. I've learned that the internet makes it frighteningly easy for people to create convincing facades for activities that might be far from what they appear. I've learned that legitimate-looking websites and professional quality materials don't guarantee that something is actually legitimate. Most importantly, I've learned that sometimes the most effective disguises are the ones that make you feel good about participating. The missing pet story was perfect because it appealed to people's natural desire to help and their emotional connection to animals. It made questioning the operation feel almost cruel, like doubting someone's genuine distress. I probably should have been more suspicious from the beginning, but hindsight makes everything seem obvious. At the time, helping someone find their lost dog seemed like the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to believe I was making a difference, and that desire made me overlook details that should have raised immediate red flags. I still check missing pet websites occasionally, looking for any sign that Max was real and that my cynicism about the whole operation was unfounded. I keep hoping to see his photo appear in a genuine appeal, or to find evidence that Sarah was exactly who she claimed to be. But deep down, I know that's not going to happen. The truth is that I'll probably never know for certain what I was really doing during those weeks of systematic distributions. I'll never know if my participation contributed to anything harmful, or if my suspicions were entirely unfounded. What I do know is that the experience has fundamentally changed how I think about trust and vulnerability in our increasingly connected world. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm checking the locks on my doors, I wonder if the people who organized that operation know that I figured out what they were really doing. I wonder if they're still out there, running similar operations with different covers, exploiting other people's desire to help and their natural compassion for animals or missing persons. I keep starting and then stopping, which probably tells you everything you need to know about how hard this is to talk about. Not because I can't remember how it started. I remember it perfectly. Every detail is burned into my memory with the kind of clarity that makes you wish you could forget. And not because time has made it easier. If anything, the distance has made it worse, given me more space to see all the moments I could have stopped and didn't. Is that saying it out loud means admitting how ordinary it all was at the beginning? How little effort it took to slide into something I still struggle to explain without sounding like I should have known better. There was no moment of dramatic choice, no fork in the road where I consciously decided to do the wrong thing. It was more like a gentle slope that got steeper, so gradually I didn't notice until I was already falling. There's a particular kind of shame that comes with realizing you weren't unlucky. You weren't singled out by some sophisticated predator. You weren't targeted because of who you are or what you know. You were just careless in a quiet, everyday way. The sort of carelessness that doesn't announce itself while it's happening. The sort that feels completely normal, even sensible, until you look back and see it for what it was. It only becomes obvious later, when you're lying awake at 3 a.m., replaying every decision, seeing all the warning signs you ignored because they were inconvenient, or because acknowledging them would have meant admitting you'd already gone too far. I replayed the start enough times to know exactly where things tipped from harmless curiosity into something else. I can point to the precise moment, the exact click. Even now, I can't give you a clean explanation for why I kept going beyond that point. Words like bored or curious feel too convenient, too easy. They let me off the hook in a way I don't deserve. Calling it a mistake feels like shrinking it into something manageable, something forgivable. The truth is messier than that. The truth is it felt normal at the time, almost routine, like browsing social media or checking the news. Just another tab open in my browser. Another way to kill time on an unremarkable evening. I wasn't an IT person. I didn't work in tech. I had no special knowledge of computers or security beyond what anyone picks up from using them every day. I think that matters because I never felt like I was deliberately entering a world I didn't understand. I was just clicking through things that felt no more dangerous than anything else people stumble across online. It started with a message that didn't belong. My sister had mentioned, casually over Sunday lunch a week earlier, that she was looking for a second-hand travel cot. She was pregnant with her first and trying to do everything on a budget, the way first-time parents do, convinced they can navigate it all with second-hand furniture and sheer determination. I'd agreed to keep an eye out, the way you do when family asks you something and you're only half paying attention but want to seem helpful. So one evening, a Thursday I think, I was scrolling through a marketplace app, phone in one hand, TV on in the background, playing some crime drama. I wasn't really watching. Not really paying attention to either. Just filling the space between dinner and sleep with the kind of mindless activity that passes for relaxation. I'd been at it for maybe 20 minutes, scrolling past baby clothes and high chairs and all the detritus of early parenthood that people are desperate to get rid of. Most of the listings were fine, some overpriced. Some looked like they'd been through a war, but nothing unusual. That's when a reply popped up from an account I hadn't contacted. At first, I barely noticed it. The notification appeared at the top of my screen, and I swiped it down out of habit. Unsolicited messages are common enough on those apps that they blur into the background. You learn to filter them out without really thinking about it. But when I opened it properly, something about it felt different. It was just a short web address and a vague suggestion that there were things you could watch there that weren't meant for normal sites. No emoji, no exclamation marks, no obvious grammatical errors that would have marked it as spam. It was almost businesslike in its brevity. No sales pitch, no pressure. No begging me to click or warning that the link would expire soon. That's what made it unsettling, I think. It didn't behave like spam. It didn't need to persuade me of anything. Like it assumed curiosity would do the work on its own. Like whoever sent it knew that the less they said, the more intriguing it would seem. I reported it through the app and kept scrolling. Felt vaguely pleased with myself for doing the sensible thing, for not being one of those people who falls for obvious scams. Deleted the message, blocked the user, went back to looking at travel cots. Found a decent one for my sister, screenshotted it, sent it to her. She replied with a thumbs up. Normal evening, normal interaction, nothing out of the ordinary. For a while, that really did feel like the end of it. But later that night, when the flat had gone quiet and the TV was off and I'd brushed my teeth and gotten into bed, I picked my phone up again out of habit. You know how it is. That last scroll through social media before sleep, checking nothing in particular, just filling the silence. And the message resurfaced in my thoughts. Not loudly, not insistently, just persistently enough that it was hard to ignore. I told myself it was probably nothing. Spam sent to 1,000 people hoping one idiot would bite. But it didn't feel like a mass message. The wording was too specific, too knowing. I remember thinking that even if it was nonsense, confirming that would make it easier to forget. That felt reasonable at the time, logical even, just scratching an itch so I could move on. So I reopened the deleted messages. The app keeps them for a while even after you delete them, which I'd never really thought about before. And I copied the address into my notes app. Told myself I'd only look briefly, just long enough to reassure myself it was rubbish, just enough to confirm my initial instinct had been right. Even as I did it, there was a small voice wondering why this explanation was doing so much work, why I needed to justify looking at a website to myself. But I pushed that voice down. Getting access wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where I felt like I crossed a clear boundary. No warning screen asking if I was sure I wanted to continue. Just small steps, each justifiable on its own. A browser that promised privacy. A few clicks to verify I was human. A simple yes/no question about being over 18. Steps I kept telling myself didn't add up to anything serious. People browse dodgy websites all the time, don't they? That's what I told myself. It's half of what the internet is. What I found wasn't sleek or impressive or mysterious. It was messy, dated, poorly organized. Plain text pages, broken menus, lists of things laid out with all the charm of a badly designed website from 1999. There were obvious illegal services right there on the front page. Fake documents, stolen accounts, credit card details, other things written about in neutral, almost bored language, and then darker sections threaded through it all, described with that same flat tone, like what was being offered was neither shocking nor exceptional. That flatness stayed with me. It still does. It didn't feel like a horror film or a hidden underworld full of shadowy figures and encrypted messages. More like browsing a catalogue where the items just happen to involve human harm. Stripped of drama or context. Mundane in the most disturbing way possible. For about a week, I dipped in and out. Never for very long. 20 minutes here, half an hour there. Usually late at night when I couldn't sleep. Always telling myself I was just looking, just observing. That observation wasn't the same as participation. That staying detached somehow kept me separate from what I was seeing. That as long as I didn't interact, didn't contribute, didn't become part of it, I was somehow still on the outside looking in. I didn't contact anyone, didn't buy anything, didn't post in any forums or leave any comments. At the time, those distinctions felt important. They felt like lines I was maintaining, boundaries I wasn't crossing. They let me believe I was still in control, still making conscious choices, still outside of it all in some meaningful way. I told myself I was trying to understand how these places worked, that it was educational in a morbid sort of way. The same way people watch documentaries about serial killers or read books about disasters, trying to understand the darker corners of human nature from a safe distance. But if I'm honest, and I suppose that's the point of telling this, I didn't have a good reason. It was just there, and I could access it, and some base part of my brain wanted to see what I wasn't supposed to see. Then I clicked a video. I'd been browsing for maybe 15 minutes, about to close the laptop and go to bed. The page was unremarkable. Vague title suggesting proof of something without explaining what. The file just sat there with no description, no comments, no preview image. Just a blank space and a play button. I hovered over it longer than I like to admit. Knew I could still close the laptop and walk away. But I told myself seeing it briefly would be no worse than everything else I'd already looked at. In hindsight, that feels like a lie. I told myself purely for convenience. The video opened on an ordinary room, cheap carpet, radiator beneath a window, a bed with a plain duvet that could have come from anywhere. The camera angle was slightly off, like a phone propped against something without much care. For a few seconds, my brain tried to reinterpret what I was seeing, offering harmless explanations because that's what it does when it needs to protect itself. But then the person on the bed moved, and the movement was wrong. Wrong in a way that's hard to explain unless you've seen it. It was driven by panic, not performance. A blurred figure stepped briefly into frame. The reaction that followed was immediate, frantic. Animal fear that made my throat tighten and my stomach drop. It didn't look like something anyone would choose to show. I shut the laptop hard enough to sting my fingers. Sat on the sofa with my hands on my knees, feeling overheated and nauseous at the same time. Staring at nothing while my heart hammered. The thought of calling the police came immediately, but it was followed just as quickly by the realization that I had no useful information, no names, no locations, no explanation for how I'd ended up there that didn't feel loaded with implication. I told myself going back to look for clues would be the responsible thing to do, framed it as trying to undo the damage of my curiosity. That justification made it possible to sleep that night. I lasted 3 days. When I went back, the video was gone, removed without explanation. In its place was a short line of text that didn't read like an update or an apology, more like a correction aimed at the people who'd watched. It implied that viewing had been noted, that anonymity was an assumption, not a guarantee, that the distance I'd felt wasn't as real as I'd wanted to believe. That was the moment it stopped feeling abstract. I shut everything down after that, powered off the laptop, tried to return to normal life, told myself the message was probably generic, designed to scare people without any real follow-through. For about a week, nothing happened. Slowly, against my better judgment, I started to believe it. Let myself relax just enough that the tension became background noise. Then an email arrived while I was at work. No subject line, random sender, single attachment. It was a photograph of my front door, not a similar door or a stock image, my actual door, with the scuffed paint near the handle and the dented letterbox I'd never bothered to fix. Taken from the communal hallway. When I zoomed in, I could see a parcel on the doormat that had arrived the day before. That small, ordinary detail made it impossible to dismiss. I was surrounded by people talking and typing, but I felt suddenly isolated. My hands shook enough that I had to hide my phone under a notebook. The journey home passed in a blur. When I unlocked my door, I stood there listening for a moment, as if the flat might sound different. Of course it didn't. Everything looked normal at first, until I noticed my laptop sitting open on the coffee table, screen glowing softly, even though I was certain I'd left it closed. On the screen was a document with a single sentence, not threatening or dramatic, just corrective, like someone pointing out an error. Below it was an instruction telling me to check the bathroom. I hesitated longer than I needed to, arguing with myself, but standing still felt worse than knowing. In the bath, sitting in a shallow pool of water, was a phone that looked exactly like mine. Same model, same case, the cheap, clear one I'd bought from a market stall. Same crack in the bottom right corner from when I dropped it getting off the bus 6 months ago. Even the cheap sticker I'd stuck on the back without thinking, a cartoon cat a friend had given me as a joke. My real phone was still in my hand. I sat on the edge of the bath staring at it, trying not to be sick, trying to work out what it meant. This wasn't just a threat. This was effort. This was planning. This required time and proximity. They'd needed to buy a phone that matched mine exactly, find the same case, even replicate the crack and the sticker, or, and this thought made my skin crawl, they'd watched me long enough to know exactly which phone I had, down to the smallest details, long enough to order an identical one and prepare it perfectly. The message was simple and unmistakable. Someone had been inside my home, hadn't taken anything, hadn't damaged anything, had left something behind instead. Proof of access. Proof that walls and locks meant nothing. Proof that they could reach me whenever they wanted. When I called the police, I reported a break-in and nothing more. After they left, the flat felt different, like it didn't entirely belong to me anymore. Around 2 a.m., another email arrived. This time, the attachment was a video recorded from inside my living room, from a high angle I didn't recognize, showing me earlier that evening, after the police had gone, sitting on the sofa rubbing my face. The timestamp was real. I watched myself move through the room, a version of myself that looked unaware and exposed. It didn't matter that I couldn't see the camera. The footage proved it existed. I left before dawn, drove to my sister's house without fully deciding to. Told her there'd been a break-in and I didn't want to be alone. Left out the parts I couldn't say yet. The following morning a message arrived through the same marketplace app where it had all begun. A photograph of my sister's back garden, taken from outside the fence. Me visible through the kitchen window. That's when I understood. I'd brought it with me. I went back to my flat that afternoon. The laptop was open again, this time displaying a message that accused me of running, of involving other people, giving a rough time for the following evening. I convinced myself that staying would keep the danger focused on me, though that logic feels thin now. That night I sat in the living room with one lamp on, listening. Just before 9, I heard movement outside the door, saw a hooded figure through the peephole, waiting on the landing. My phone buzzed with a photograph taken from inside the room, from behind me, moments earlier. When I turned, I eventually noticed a book pushed forward on the shelf. Behind it, taped to the back, was a small camera, still warm when I touched it, smaller than a box of matches, wireless probably. How long had it been there? How many days had I been watched? I destroyed it without thinking, smashed it against the coffee table until it was pieces. The footsteps fled down the stairs. There was no contact after that, no messages, no reminders, just silence that felt less like safety and more like being spared. I moved out 3 months later. Couldn't stand being in that flat anymore. Told my sister the truth in fragments, piece by piece. Enough that she understood. Not enough to make her as scared as I was. Learned that nothing else happening didn't mean it was over. Only that it had stopped. That the person on the other end had decided to stop, for now, for reasons I'd never understand. There was no clever trick, no supernatural explanation. Just a stranger who enjoyed access, who enjoyed power, who enjoyed fear, and a lesson about how little distance there really is between looking and being seen, between observer and observed, between thinking you're safe behind a screen and realizing the screen was never actually there. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me last year, and I need you to understand that I'm not proud of any of it. I was completely broke, right? I had just lost my job at this portrait studio in Leicester, couldn't make rent on my bedsit, and I was getting desperate, really desperate. So when I found this photography work that paid more than I'd ever earned before, I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. I told myself it was just stock photography, that I was being clever finding a new income stream. But the truth is, I knew something wasn't right from the beginning. I just chose to ignore it because I needed the money so badly. I'm in this grotty hotel room in Blackpool now, and I've lost everything. My home, my equipment, probably my career. All because I was too greedy and too stupid to walk away when I had the chance. I keep thinking if I tell someone what really happened, maybe I'll be able to sleep at night again. The whole thing started when I was scrolling through photography websites looking for any kind of freelance work that might help me scrape together next month's rent. I'd been a professional photographer for nearly 15 years, mostly weddings and family portraits, until digital photography made everyone think they could do the job themselves. Buried in the classified section of an obscure photography forum, I found an advert that caught my attention. Someone was offering good money for candid street photography. Natural shots of people going about their daily lives in various British towns and cities. No stage portraits or commercial work, just authentic moments captured without the subject's knowledge. The rates were surprisingly generous, about twice what I'd been earning for wedding photography. The client explained they were building a stock photo library focused on genuine British life, the sort of authentic imagery that advertising agencies and publishers couldn't create in studios. I should have questioned why they needed covert photography when legitimate stock photo companies used models and signed releases. Should have wondered why the payment was so much higher than standard rates for this type of work. But I was desperate, and the client seemed professional in their communications. They provided a list of locations where they wanted photography: town centres, shopping areas, residential streets, even some specific addresses where they claimed interesting architectural features or local colour could be captured. The brief was simple: photograph people naturally, without them realising they were being captured, focusing on individuals rather than crowds. The first assignment was straightforward enough. I spent a weekend in Nottingham with my camera, capturing street scenes and candid moments. People walking to shops, sitting in cafes, waiting for buses. The sort of everyday British life that the client claimed to want for their stock library. I submitted about 50 photographs through their secure upload system, each one carefully composed and technically proficient. The client was pleased with my work and paid promptly, transferring the fee directly to my bank account within 24 hours. Over the following weeks, the assignments became more specific. Instead of general street photography, the client began providing particular locations and times when they wanted images captured. They claimed this was to ensure good lighting conditions and interesting subjects, but the level of detail seemed unusual. I was given specific streets to photograph at certain times of day, particular shops or buildings where I should position myself, even descriptions of the types of people I should focus on. Young women, elderly individuals, families with children, always with emphasis on capturing clear facial features and identifying details. The technical requirements became more demanding too. The client wanted high-resolution images that could be cropped extensively without losing detail. They specified particular camera settings and lens types that would maximize image quality and facial clarity. I convinced myself this was just professional thoroughness, that serious stock photography required this level of technical precision. The money was keeping me afloat financially, and I was grateful to have found steady work that utilized my skills. But I started noticing patterns in the assignment locations that made me uncomfortable. Many of the addresses were residential streets rather than commercial areas. The timing requirements often coincided with school-run hours or typical commuting times, and the demographic focus seemed designed to capture vulnerable individuals rather than general street scenes. When I questioned these specifications, the client explained they were targeting particular market segments for advertising campaigns. Different demographics required different types of authentic imagery, they claimed, and the timing was important to capture people in natural, unstressed situations. That explanation seemed reasonable enough, though I was becoming increasingly aware that my photography was more invasive than typical street photography. I was essentially conducting surveillance, documenting people's routines, and capturing identifying information without their knowledge or consent. The breakthrough moment came when I recognized someone in one of my assignments. It was Emma, a woman I'd met through mutual friends at a barbecue the previous summer. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital and lived in a small terraced house in a quiet suburb of Derby. The client had specifically requested photography of her street during morning hours, with particular focus on individuals leaving for work. When I saw Emma emerge from her house and walk to her car, I realized the client somehow knew her routine and had commissioned surveillance photographs of her daily activities. This wasn't stock photography. It was targeted surveillance of specific individuals. The client wasn't building a general image library, but collecting intelligence about particular people's movements and routines. And I'd been facilitating this surveillance by providing high-quality photographic evidence of their daily lives. I tried to convince myself there might be innocent explanations. Maybe Emma was applying for a job and the client was conducting background verification. Maybe there was a legitimate investigation that required documenting her activities. But deep down, I knew that legitimate surveillance wouldn't require a freelance photographer working through anonymous online platforms. I should have stopped accepting assignments then, should have deleted all the photographs I'd taken and walked away from the whole arrangement. But the money was too good, and I was too financially desperate to give up steady income based on suspicions I couldn't prove. Instead, I started keeping copies of all the photographs I submitted, telling myself I was preserving evidence in case there were legal questions later. What I discovered when I reviewed the images systematically was more disturbing than I'd expected. The photographs weren't random street scenes, but carefully coordinated surveillance of dozens of individuals across multiple cities. Each person had been photographed repeatedly over weeks or months, documenting their routines, relationships, and vulnerabilities with methodical precision. I could see patterns emerging from the collective imagery. The same individuals photographed at work, at home, during leisure activities, even in private moments when they thought they were unobserved. The client was building comprehensive visual profiles of these people's lives. Some of the individuals appeared to be single women living alone. Others were families with young children, and a few were elderly people who seemed isolated and vulnerable. What connected them wasn't obvious from the photographs alone, but someone had identified them as targets worth systematic surveillance. I started researching the individuals I'd photographed, using social media and public records to understand who they were and why they might be of interest to my client. What I found was a collection of ordinary people living normal lives, with no apparent connection to each other or reason to warrant surveillance. Emma the nurse, a teacher in Wolverhampton, a retired couple in Stoke-on-Trent, a young mother in Mansfield, all documented with invasive detail by someone who'd commissioned comprehensive photographic intelligence about their daily activities. The most disturbing discovery was finding some of my photographs on hidden websites that I accessed using software the client had provided for secure file transfers. The images weren't being used for stock photography or advertising campaigns. They were being shared among communities focused on stalking and harassment. My photographs were being used to plan approach strategies, identify vulnerabilities, even coordinate group harassment campaigns against the individuals I'd documented. The detailed visual intelligence I'd provided was enabling serious crimes against people who had no idea they were being targeted. The technical precision the client had demanded, high resolution, facial clarity, identifying details, was designed to make the surveillance photographs as useful as possible for criminal purposes. I'd been creating a visual database that stalkers and harassers could use to identify and approach their victims. Some of the individuals in my photographs had become subjects of elaborate stalking campaigns that used the intelligence I'd provided to predict their movements and exploit their routines. Others had been targeted for harassment based on vulnerabilities that were apparent from careful analysis of their photographed behavior. I found discussion threads where people shared techniques for using surveillance photographs to approach targets without arousing suspicion. They analyzed facial expressions and body language from my images to develop psychological profiles of their intended victims. The visual evidence I'd gathered was being combined with other intelligence sources to create comprehensive targeting packages that enabled systematic harassment and stalking. My photography had become part of an industrial-scale operation focused on identifying and exploiting vulnerable individuals. I tried contacting the client to demand that my photographs be removed from these criminal websites, but they disappeared as completely as if they'd never existed. The payment arrangements were closed, the communication channels were dead, and there was no way to trace who had commissioned the surveillance or how to stop the criminal use of my work. That's when I realized I was probably in danger myself. I'd seen the criminal operation from the inside, understood how it worked, and possessed evidence that could potentially expose the people behind it. The same surveillance techniques I'd been using to document others could easily be turned against me. I started noticing signs that I was being watched. People photographing me from across the street, cars following me between assignments, even evidence that someone had been through my bedsit while I was out. The network I'd been working for had identified me as a potential security threat. The final straw came when I found photographs of myself posted on one of the criminal websites I'd discovered. Not just casual surveillance images, but detailed documentation of my daily routine, my financial difficulties, even my personal relationships. Someone was building the same type of targeting package about me that I'd helped create for others. I realized that freelance photographers like me weren't just independent contractors for this operation. We were also potential liabilities who needed to be monitored and controlled. The client had been documenting my activities as carefully as I'd been documenting their surveillance targets. That's when I decided to run, packed essential belongings, withdrew what money I could access, and drove to this seaside town where I hoped I could disappear for a while. Left behind my equipment, my home, even my car in a long-stay car park where it might not be found immediately. But I don't think distance will protect me from people who've industrialized surveillance and harassment. They have resources, connections, and techniques that far exceed anything individual victims can counter. They've turned stalking into a collaborative enterprise with professional standards and systematic methods. I keep thinking about Emma and all the other people I photographed, all the ordinary individuals whose privacy I violated without understanding the consequences. They're probably still being harassed and stalked based on intelligence I helped provide, still living in fear because someone decided their personal lives were worth commodifying. The photographs are still out there, still being used to facilitate crimes against people who did nothing except exist in public spaces where I happened to be pointing my camera. The visual evidence I created in exchange for money I desperately needed has become a permanent resource for people who treat others' safety as entertainment. Sometimes I wonder how many other photographers are out there, taking pictures for clients they don't really understand, providing the raw materials for criminal enterprises they can't see. How many of us are there, desperately trying to make a living in the gig economy, accepting assignments that seem too good to be true because we can't afford to ask uncomfortable questions? The most frightening thing is how easy it all was, how professional skills could be monetized for criminal purposes. how financial desperation could be exploited to facilitate serious crimes, how the desire to work could be turned into complicity with systematic harassment. I just hope Emma and the others have managed to stay safe despite the intelligence I helped compile about their lives. And I hope that whoever is now watching me will decide I'm not worth the trouble of eliminating as a witness to what they're doing. But I'm not optimistic about either possibility, because I've learned that in the digital age, privacy is an illusion, safety is temporary, and anyone with a camera can become an unwitting accomplice to crimes they never intended to facilitate. I keep thinking this is someone else's life I'm living now. 8 weeks ago, my biggest worry was making rent on my flat in Brixton. Now I have a burner phone, 3 different hair colors in my bathroom bin, and a constant feeling like there's a target on my back, all because I tried to help someone I thought was my friend. My name doesn't matter anymore. I used to be a paralegal at a mid-sized corporate law firm in London. Nothing special, just contract reviews and document preparation. The pay was decent. My flat was small, but mine. And I had what I thought were good friends. Tara was one of them. We met at the firm 3 years ago. She was in marketing. I was in legal. We weren't best mates or anything, but we got lunch together sometimes and complained about our bosses. About 2 months ago, Tara stopped showing up to work. No calls, no emails, nothing. After a week, HR just said she'd resigned for personal reasons. It happened pretty quickly. One day she was there. The next her desk was cleared out. A few people tried calling her, but her number was disconnected. Her social media went dark. Nobody seemed particularly worried. People quit all the time. Except I had just seen her the Friday before she disappeared. We'd gotten drinks after work at our local in Soho, and she seemed fine. Better than fine, actually. She was excited about some side project she was working on that was going to let her finally quit the corporate grind. She was being secretive about it, but in a fun way, not concerning. Said she'd tell me all about it once everything was finalized. So when she vanished, I was worried. I tried her email, her old flatmate, even drove by her apartment in Clapham. The flatmate said Tara had moved out suddenly, no forwarding address. The building manager said the same thing. Rent paid through the month, keys left in the letterbox. That might have been the end of it, except for the thumb drive. Tara had borrowed my external hard drive a few weeks before she disappeared, saying she needed extra storage for some marketing videos. When she returned it, apparently she accidentally left one of her own thumb drives in the case. I didn't notice until I was using the hard drive myself and found this unmarked black USB stick. I figured it probably had her marketing stuff on it, maybe something she'd need for her new venture. I plugged it in, thinking I could email whatever files were on it to her personal account. Even if she didn't respond. The drive was password protected, which was odd for work files. I was about to give up when I remembered Tara always used the same password for everything. Her cat's name, plus the year she graduated uni. It worked on the first try. There were only a few files on the drive. One was a text document with what looked like login credentials. Another was a spreadsheet with dates, times and amounts. Large amounts, like tens of thousands of pounds each. The third was a video file simply labeled verification. The video wasn't long, maybe 2 minutes. It started with a black screen and text stating the date from about a month ago. Then it showed a plain room with concrete walls, maybe a basement. There was a person tied to a chair in the center, head covered with some kind of hood. A figure in a dark mask stood behind them, holding up a piece of paper with a series of numbers and today's date. like those hostage verification videos you sometimes hear about. The masked person then set the paper down, picked up something from a table just off camera, and approached the bound person. That's when I closed the video. I didn't want to see what happened next. I felt sick. My first thought was that this was some kind of joke, or maybe footage from an indie horror film Tara was working on. But then why the spreadsheet with all that money? And why would she have disappeared right after? I reopened the text file with the credentials. There was a URL I didn't recognize, not a normal website's address, but something ending in .onion. I knew enough to recognize it as a Tor address, those hidden sites you can only access with special browsers. Below it was a username and password, along with instructions for a two-factor authentication app. I should have gone to the police right then. That would have been the smart thing to do. But I kept thinking about Tara. What if she was the person in that chair? What if she was in trouble and needed help? And if I'm being honest, I was curious. What was this thing she had been so excited about that had potentially gotten her into trouble? I installed the Tor browser that night. It took some figuring out, but I managed to get to the address. It looked like a simple login page with a plain black background and the word observatory at the top. No other information, no hints about what the site was for. I entered the username and password from the file. The next page asked for a verification code from the authentication app. I didn't have that, so I couldn't go further. But there was a small help link at the bottom of the page. I clicked it, expecting FAQs or contact information. Instead, it took me to a page explaining what the site was, a viewing platform for private events. The description was clinical, almost businesslike, but I understood what it meant. This was a red room, one of those dark web urban legends where people pay to watch torture or murder in real time. Except it wasn't a legend. It was real, and somehow Tara was involved. The page explained the pricing tiers. Basic membership was £8,000, which allowed viewing access only. Executive membership was £40,000, which granted voting rights on what happened during events. And then there was producer status at £200,000, which allowed members to commission specific events. I closed the browser immediately. This couldn't be real. These things didn't actually exist. They were stories people told to scare each other, like alligators in the sewers or razor blades in Halloween candy. But then I remembered the verification video, the date card, the spreadsheet, with all those transactions. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about Tara, about that video, about what I had found. Had she stumbled onto this like I had? Or was she involved somehow? I couldn't imagine her participating in something so horrific. But then again, she had been excited about a lucrative side project. During lunch, I used a computer in an unused conference room to do some research. I didn't want this in my search history. I looked up red rooms trying to find out if they were real or just internet folklore. Most sources said they were myths, technically impossible to stream reliably over the Tor network. But a few suggested they were real, but extremely rare, requiring significant technical infrastructure and insider connections to access. That evening, I made a decision I still regret. I went back to the site, but this time from a public computer at a library in Camden. I wanted to see if there was any way to find out more without actually logging in. There wasn't much, but I discovered a calendar of upcoming events visible on the login page. The next one was scheduled for Friday night, just 2 days away. I spent those 2 days trying to decide what to do. Go to the police. What would I say? I had a thumb drive with the disturbing video and login credentials to what might be an illegal site. Would they take me seriously? Would they think I was involved somehow? And what about Tara? If she was in danger, would going to the authorities put her at more risk? I decided to try one more thing before going to the police. I installed the two-factor authentication app and used the setup key that was in the text file. To my surprise, it worked. I now had access to the verification codes needed to fully log in. I didn't plan to actually view any events, but I thought I might find information about Tara or evidence I could take to the authorities. On Friday night, I used the Tor browser and the authentication codes to log into the observatory site. The interface was surprisingly professional, like a high-end video conferencing platform. There was a main viewing area currently showing a countdown timer with about 20 minutes remaining. Below that was a chat box where members were already discussing the upcoming event. To the right was a list of about 30 users currently online, all with anonymous handles. I didn't interact, just observed. As I watched, I noticed something disturbing. The users were discussing the subject for tonight's event, referring to them by a code name. They mentioned specific details about this person, their occupation, their habits, even their taste in music. The way they talked was clinical, almost bored, like executives discussing a business proposal. That's when a private message popped up on my screen. Someone with the username producer_3 had noticed me. The message asked if I was enjoying my first visit and whether I had received a personal invitation. They noted that my account was registered to someone else, someone who was no longer with their organization. They wanted to know how I had gained access. I didn't respond, but my heart was racing. They knew I wasn't supposed to be there. I was about to log off when another message came through. This one included my real name and address in Brixton. They said they had tracked my connection, impossible through Tor, but maybe they had other ways of monitoring access to the site. They said they knew I had Tara's drive and that I had watched the verification video. They said a car was already on its way to my flat. I shut everything down and left the library immediately. I didn't go home. I went to a hotel in King's Cross and paid cash for the room. That night, I saw on the local news that there had been a gas leak in my building. The residents had been evacuated while authorities investigated. There was footage of people standing outside in their pajamas, looking confused. I recognized my neighbors. The next morning, I withdrew as much cash as I could from my accounts, bought a prepaid phone, and got on a train to Manchester. From there, I kept moving, staying in cheap B&Bs, changing my appearance, using only cash. I've been moving ever since. I never went to the police. After seeing what happened at my flat, I'm convinced they have connections in law enforcement. These aren't amateurs. The site had too many users, too much money flowing through it. This is an organized operation with resources. Sometimes I think about the people in those videos. Were they random victims or chosen for specific reasons? Were they people who discovered something they shouldn't have, like me? Or were they selected based on those detailed profiles the members discussed, targeted specifically for someone's entertainment? I keep wondering about Tara. Was she a victim? Was she involved? Did she try to expose them and pay the price? Or did she try to profit from it somehow? I'll probably never know. I've changed hotels again today. The cleaning lady gave me a strange look this morning, like she recognized me. It might have been nothing, but I can't take chances. I'll dye my hair again tonight, maybe change my style completely. Last week, I saw a missing person flyer at a train station. It was for a man in his 30s, last seen leaving his office in Birmingham. The flyer said he worked as a cybersecurity consultant and had no history of disappearing. Something about his occupation made my stomach turn. Had he stumbled onto the same thing I had? I know they're still looking for me. I'm not important enough for them to spend significant resources on tracking down. But I've seen how their operation works. They're methodical, patient. They have money and connections, and they can't afford loose ends. Sometimes I consider turning myself in, going to the National Crime Agency rather than local police. But what proof do I have now? The thumb drive is hidden, hundreds of miles away. I have no evidence, just a story that sounds impossible. So I keep moving, keep looking over my shoulder. I've become good at spotting details, cars that linger too long, people whose eyes follow me in corner shops. I pay attention to emergency exits and back doors wherever I go. I've learned to live with less sleep. The hardest part is the isolation. I can't contact family or friends, can't use social media, can't stay in one place long enough to make connections. Some days the loneliness is worse than the fear. I don't know how long I can keep living like this. Maybe one day they'll decide I'm not worth the trouble and stop looking. Maybe I'll find a way to disappear completely, get a new identity, start over, somewhere far away. Or maybe they'll find me, and I'll become just another missing person, another name on a flyer that people glance at and forget. What haunts me most isn't the fear of being caught. It's knowing that right now, even as I write this, another event might be starting, another countdown timer reaching zero, another group of bored, wealthy viewers logging in from around the world, another person who has no idea they've been chosen. And no one would believe it's real, even if I told them. That's the perfect cover. Something so terrible most people dismiss it as an urban legend or creepypasta. Something that could never actually happen in the real world,